Chapter 36 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 36, Brother Philosophers. And now for the clang of arms, the movement, the bustle, the excitement of combat. There are swords to polish, pistols to clean, cullivers to see to. Something is in the air. We have not been brought hither all the way to this God-forsaken and fog-ridden spot in order to stare on a tumble-down Mullins, or watch a solitary prisoner ere he hang. Jan knows, of course, and Jan is eager and alert, febrile in his movements. There is a glow in his hollow eyes, and Jan always looks like that when fighting is in the air, when he sniffs the scent of blood and hears the resonance of metal against metal. Jan knows, of course. He has no thought of sleep. All night he wanders up and down the improvised camp. No fires allowed, and it is pitch dark, but an occasional glimmer from a lanthorn lights up compact groups of men lying prone upon the frozen ground, wrapped in thick coats or huddled up with knees to chin trying to keep warm. A few lanthorns are allowed far into the interior of that weird forest of beams under the molens, where the slender protection against a bitter northwesterly wind can alone be found. Shoulder to shoulder, getting warmth one from the other, we are all too excited to sleep. Something is in the air, some fighting to be done, and yet there are only 30 or 40 of us at most. But swords and cullivers have been given out, and half the night through my lord and his friends, served only by Jan, have been carrying heavy loads from the molens out towards the Schie and the wooden bridge that spans it. Silently, always coming away with those heavy loads from the molens, and walking with them away into the gloom, always returning empty-handed, and served only by Jan. Bah! We are no cullions. 'Tis not mighty difficult to guess, and by the saints, why all this mystery? Some of us are paid to fight. What care we how we do it? In the open with muskets or crossbows, or in the dark with a sudden blow which no man knows from whence it comes? All night we sit and wait, and all night we are under the eye of Jan. He serves his lord and helps him to carry these heavy boxes from the molens to some unknown place by the Schie. But he is always there when you least expect him, watching to see that all is well, that there is not too much noise, that no one has been tempted to light a fire, that we do not quarrel too hotly among ourselves. He keeps a watchful eye, too, upon the prisoner, poor beggar, with a broken shoulder and a torn hip, and some other wounds, too, about his body. A good fighter, no doubt, but there were 7 against him, and that was a good idea to swing heavy skates by their straps and to bring him down with them. His head was too high, else a blow from those sharp blades might have ended his life more kindly than the Lord of Stoutenburg hath planned to do. A merry devil, too, full of quaint jokes and tales of gay adventure. By gad, a real soldier of fortune. Devil may care, eat and drink, and make merry, for tomorrow we may die. Jan has ordered him to be kept tied to a beam. God verdome, but 'tis hard on a wounded man. But he seems tougher than he beams, and laughter in his throat quickly smothers groans. Tied to a beam, he is excellent company. Ye gods, how his hands itch to grip his sword! Peaked and red over there, let him feel the metal against his palms. 'Twill ease his temper for sure. Jan is too severe, but 'tis my lord's rage that was unbridled. Ugh, to strike a prisoner in the face! 'Twas a dirty trick, and many saw it. Hi ho, but what matter? To-morrow we fight, to-morrow he hangs. What of it? To-morrow most of us, mayhap, will be lying stark and stiff upon the frozen ground, staring up at next night's moon with eyes that no longer see. A rope round the neck, a hole in the side, a cracked skull, what matters which mode? Dame Death will choose for our ultimate end. But 'tis a pity about the prisoner, a true fighter if there was one, a stoic and a philosopher. The Cavalier we pretty soon call him. What ho, he shouts, call me the Laughing Cavalier. Poor devil, he tries not to show his hurts. He suffers much what with that damnable wind and those ropes that cut into his tough sinews. But he smiles at every twinge of pain, smiles and laughs and cracks the broadest jokes that have e'er made these worm-eaten beams ring with their echo. Laughing Cavalier in sooth. There now, we can ease him somewhat. Jan's back is turned. We dare not touch the ropes, but a cloak put between his back and the beam, and another just against his head. Is that not better, old compeer? Aye, but is it not good to be a villain and a rogue, and herd with other villains and other rogues, who are so infinitely more kind and gentle than all those noble lords? Diogenes, his head propped against the rude cushion placed there by the hand of some rough Samaritan, has fallen into a fitful doze. Whispers round him wake him with a start. Ye gods, was there ever so black a night? The whispers become more eager, more insistent. Let us but speak with him, we'll do no harm. Saint Bavon, tell us how those two scarecrows have got there, for they are here in the flesh, both of them. Diogenes would have spotted his brother philosophers through the darkness, darker than the blackest hell. Pythagoras rolling in fat, and Socrates lean and hungry looking, peering like a huge gaunt bird through the gloom. Someone is holding up a lanthorn, and Pythagoras' tip-tilted nose shines with a ruddy glow. But how did you get here, you old mushroom face? Asks one of the men. We had business with him at Rotterdam, quoth Socrates, with one of his choicest oaths, and nodding in the direction of the prisoner. All day we have wondered what has become of him. Then in the afternoon breaks in Pythagoras, to the accompaniment of a rival set of expletives. We saw him trussed up like a fowl, and tied into a sled drawn by a single horse, which started in the wake of a larger one, wherein sat a lovely jongejuffrouw. Then what did you do? queries someone. Do? exclaim the philosophers simultaneously and in a tone of deep disgust. Followed on his trail as best we could, rejoined Socrates simply. Borrowed some skates, ran down the Schie in the wake of the two sleds and their escort. And after that? After that we traced him to this solitary God-forsaken hole. But presently we saw that this molens was not so deserted as it seemed, so we hung about until now. Then we ventured near, and here we are. Here they were, of course. But how was it possible to contravene the orders of Jan? What could these scarecrows have to say to the Laughing Cavalier? Just to ask him if there's anything we can do, murmurs Socrates persuasively. He's like to hang tomorrow, you said. Well, grant something then to a dying man. Grave heads shake in the gloom. Our orders are strict. 'Tis a matter of life and death, it seems." "Bah!" quoth Pythagoras more insinuatingly still. "We are 2 to your 30. What had ye all to fear?" "Here, tie my hands behind my back," suggests Socrates. "I only want to speak with him. How could we help him to escape?" "We would not think of such a thing," murmurs Pythagoras piously. Anxious glances meet one another in consultation. More than one kindly heart beats beneath those ragged doublets. "Bah! The man is to hang to-morrow. Why not give pleasure to a dying man?" If indeed it be pleasure to look on such hideous scarecrows a few hours before death. Jan is not here. He is with my lord, helping with those heavy boxes. 5 minutes, you old mushroom face, suggests he who has been left in charge, and all the others nod approval. But they will take no risks about the prisoner. Pleasure and 5 minutes conversation with his friends, yes, but no attempt to escape. So the men make a wide circle, sitting out of earshot, but shoulder to shoulder, the 30 of them who happen to be awake. In the center of the circle is the Laughing Cavalier, tied to a beam, trussed like a fowl, since he is to hang on the morrow. Close beside his feet is the lanthorn, so that he may have a last look at his friends, and some few paces away his naked sword, which Jan took from him when the men brought him down. He has listened to their whispered conversation. He knows that his brother philosophers are here. May the God of rogues and villains bless them for their loyalty. And now, Saint Bavon, show me the best way to make use of them. There is still something to be done, which hath been left undone. A word hath been given, and that pledge must be fulfilled, and the promised fortune still awaits him who will bring the jongejuffrouw safely to her father. My God, if it were not for that broken shoulder and that torn hip, there are many hours yet before the morrow. "Old compeer," came a hoarse whisper close to his ear, "how did you come to such a pass?" "They came and took the jongejuffrouw away from Rotterdam," he replied, also speaking in a whisper. "I had just returned from Delft, where I had business to transact, and I recognized Jan beside the sledge into which the jongejuffrouw was stepping even then. He had 10 or a dozen men with him. I felt that they meant mischief, but I had to follow. I had to find out whither they were taking her." "Verdammt," growled Socrates under his breath, "why did you not take us along?" "I meant to come back for you as soon as I knew, but in the dark, and from behind 7 of these fellows fell upon me. They used their skates like javelins, mine were still on my feet. I had only Bucephalus. A blow from one of the heaviest blades cracked my shoulder, another caught me on the hip. There were 7 of them," he reiterated with a careless laugh. "It was only a question of time. They were bound to bring me down in the end." "But who has done this?" queried Pythagoras with an oath. "A lucky rogue on whom God hath chosen to smile. But," he added more seriously, and sinking his voice to the lowest possible whisper, "never mind about the past. Let us think of the future, old compeers." "We are ready," they replied simultaneously. "A knife," he murmured. "Can you cut these confounded ropes?" "They took everything from us," growled Socrates, "ere they let us approach you. Try with your hands to loose the knots." "What ho, you brigands, what are you doing there?" In a moment the circle round broke up. A crowd of angry faces were gathered closely round the philosophers, and more than one pair of rough hands were laid upon their shoulders. "Play fair, you two," cried Piet the Red, who was in command, or we'll tie you both to the nearest beams and await my lord's commands." "Easy, easy, friend," quoth Diogenes with a pleasant laugh. "My nose was itching, and my compeer held on to my arm while he tried to reach my nose in order to scratch it." "Then if it itch again," retorted the man with an equally jovial laugh, "call for my services, friend. And now, you two scarecrows, the 5 minutes are over. Jan will be here in a moment." But they formed up the circle once more, kind and compassionate. Jan was not yet here, and the rogues had had a warning. They were not like to be at their tricks again. "Never mind about me," whispered Diogenes hurriedly, as Pythagoras and Socrates, baffled and furious, were giving forth samples of their choicest vocabularies. "You see that chance alone can favour me, and she chooses. If not, 'tis no matter. What you can do for me is far more important than cheating the gallows of my carcass." "What is it?" they asked simply. "The jongejuffrouw," he said. "You know where she is." "In the hut close by," replied Socrates. "We saw the sledge draw up there." "But the house is well guarded," murmured Pythagoras. "Nor would I ask you to run your heads in the same noose wherein mine will be swinging to-morrow. But keep the hut well in sight. Any moment now there may be a call of Sauve Qui Peut, every man for himself, and the greatest luck to the swiftest runner." "But why?" "Never mind why, it is sure to happen. Any minute you may hear the cry, confusion, terror, a scramble and a rush for the open." "And our opportunity," came in a hoarse whisper from Socrates. "I think that I begin to understand. We lie low for the present, and when Sauve Qui Peut is called, we come straight back here and free you. In the confusion they will have forgotten you." "If the confusion occurs in time," quoth Diogenes with his habitual carelessness, "you may still find me here trussed like a fowl to this verdiment beam. But I have an idea that the Lord of Stoutenburg will presently be consumed with impatience to see me hang. He has just finished some important work by the bridge on the Schie. He won't be able to sleep, and the devil will be suggesting some mischief for his idle hands to do. There will be many hours to kill before daylight. One of them might be well employed in hanging me." "Then we'll not leave you an instant," asserted Pythagoras firmly. "What can you do, you two old scarecrows, against the Lord of Stoutenburg, who has 30 men here paid to do his bidding? We are not going to lie low and play the part of cowards while you are being slaughtered." "You will do just what I ask, faithful old compeers," rejoined Diogenes more earnestly than his wont. "You will lie very low, and take the greatest possible care not to run your heads into the same rope, wherein mayhap mine will dangle presently. Nor will you be playing the part of cowards, for you have not yet learned the ABC of that part, and you will remember that on your safety and freedom of action lies my one chance, not so much of life as of saving my last shred of honor." "What do you mean?" "The jongejuffrouw," he whispered. "I swore to bring her back to her father, and I must cheat a rascal of his victory. In the confusion, at dawn to-morrow, think above all the jongejuffrouw. In the confusion you can overpower the guard, rush the miller's hut where she is, carry her off. The horses are in the shed behind the hut. You may not have time to think of me." "But—" "Silence, they listen. One of us with the jongejuffrouw, the other to help you. Silence, I may be a dead man by then. The jongejuffrouw, remember, make for Ryswyk with her first of all. thence straight to Haarlem to her father. You can do that easily. A fortune awaits you if you bring her safely to him. Fulfill my pledge, old compeers, if I am not alive to do it myself. I do not ask you to swear. I know you will do it, and if I must to the gallows first, I'll do so with a cry of triumph. But you—" "Silence," he murmured again peremptorily, but more hoarsely this time, for fatigue and loss of blood and tense excitement are telling upon his iron physique at last. He is well nigh spent and scarce able to speak. "Silence, I can hear Jan's footsteps. Here, quick, inside my boot, a wallet. Have you got it?" he added with a brief return to his habitual gaiety, as he felt Socrates' long fingers groping against his shins, and presently beheld his wallet in his compeer's hand. "You will find money in there, enough for the journey. Now, quick into the night, you two. Disappear for the nonce, and anon when Sauve Qui Peut rings in the air, to-night or at the dawn, or whenever this may be, remember the jongejuffrouw first of all, and when you are ready to give the cry we all know so well, the cry of the fox when it lures its prey. If I am not dangling on the gibbet by then, I shall understand. But quick now, Jan comes. Disappear, I say." Quickly and swiftly Socrates slipped the wallet with some of the money back into his friend's boot. The rest he hid inside his own doublet. Strange that between these men there was no need of oaths. Pythagoras and Socrates had said nothing. Silent and furtive they disappeared into the darkness. Diogenes' head sank down upon his breast with a last sigh of satisfaction. He knew that his compeers would do what he had asked. Jan's footsteps rang on the hard frozen ground. Silently the living circle had parted, and the philosophers were swallowed up in the gloom. Jan looked suspiciously at the groups of men who now stand desultorily around. "Who was standing beside the prisoner just now?" he asked curtly. "When, Captain?" queries one of the men blandly. "A moment ago. I was descending the steps. The lanthorn was close to the prisoner. I saw two forms that looked unfamiliar to me, close to him." "Oh," rejoined Piet the Red unblushingly, "it must have been my back that you saw, Captain. Willem and I were looking to see that the ropes had not given way. The prisoner is so restless." Jan, not altogether reassured, goes up to the prisoner. He raises the lanthorn and has a good and comprehensive look at all the ropes. Then he examines the man's face. "What ho!" he cries. "A bottle of spiced wine from my wallet? The prisoner has fainted." End of chapter 36.
Chapter 37 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 37. Dawn. What a commotion when dawn breaks at last! It comes grey, dull, leaden, scarce lighter than the night, the haze more dense, the frost more biting. But it does break, at last, after that interminable night of excitement and sleeplessness and preparations for the morrow. Jan has never closed an eye. He has scarcely rested even, pacing up and down, in and out of those gargantuan beams, with the molens and its secrets towering above his head. Nor I imagine did those noble lords and mynheers up there sleep much during this night. But they were tired, and lay like logs upon straw palaces, living over again the past few hours, the carrying of heavy iron boxes one by one from the molens to the wooden bridge, the unloading there, the unpacking in the darkness, and the disposal of the death-dealing powder, black and evil-smelling, which will put an end with its one mighty crash to tyranny and the stadtholder's life. Tired they are, but too excited to sleep. The last few hours are like a vivid dream. The preparation of the tinder, the arrangements, the position to be taken up by Beresteyn and Heemskerk, the two chosen lieutenants who will send the wooden bridge over the Schie flying in splinters into the air. Van Does, too, has his work cut out. General in command of the forces, foreign mercenaries and louts from the country, he has Jan for able captain. The mercenaries and the louts know nothing yet of what will happen tomorrow, when once the dawn has broken, but they are well prepared. Like beasts of the desert, they can scent blood in the air. Look at them polishing up their swords and cleaning their cullivers. They know that tomorrow they will fight, even though tonight they have had no orders, save to see that one prisoner tied with ropes to a beam, and fainting with exposure and loss of blood, does not contrive to escape. But the Lord of Stoutenburg is more wakeful than all. Like a caged beast of prey, he paces up and down the low, narrow weighing-room of the molens, his hands tightly clenched behind his back, his head bare, his cloak cast aside, despite the bitter coldness of the night, restless and like a beast of prey. His nostrils quiver with the lust of hate and revenge that seethes within his soul. 2 men doth he hate with a consuming passion of hatred: the Stadtholder, Prince of Orange, sovereign ruler of half the Netherlands, and a penniless adventurer whose very name is unknown. Both these men are now in the power of the Lord of Stoutenburg. The bridge is prepared, the powder laid. Tomorrow justice will be meted out to the tyrant. God alone could save him now, and God, of a surety, must be on the side of a just revenge. The other man is helpless and a prisoner. Despite his swagger and his insolence, justice shall be meted out to him too. God alone could save him, and God, of a surety, could not be on the side of an impudent rogue. These thoughts, which were as satisfying to the Lord of Stoutenburg as food placed at an unattainable distance is to a starving beast, kept him awake and pacing up and down the room after he had finished his work under the bridge. He could not sleep for thinking of the prisoner, of the man's insolence, of the humiliation and contempt wherewith every glance he had brought shame to his cheeks. The Lord of Stoutenburg could not sleep also for thinking of Gilda, and the tender, pitying eyes wherewith she regarded the prisoner, the gentle tone of her voice when she spoke to him, even after proof had been placed before her that the man was a forger and a thief. The Lord of Stoutenburg could not sleep, and all the demons of jealousy, of hatred, and of revenge were chasing him up and down the room, and whispering suggestions of mischief to be wrought, of a crime to be easily committed. "While that man lives," whispered the demon of hate in his ear, "thou wilt not know a moment's rest. Tomorrow, when thy hand should be steady, when it wields the dagger against the Stadtholder, it will tremble and falter, for thoughts of that man will unsettle thy nerves and cause the blood to tingle in thy veins." "While that man lives," whispered the demon of revenge, "thou wilt not know a moment's rest. Thou wilt think of him and of his death rather than of thy revenge against the Stadtholder." "While that man lives," whispered the demon of jealousy more insistently than did the other evil spirits, "Gilda will not cease to think of him. She will plead for him. She will try mayhap to save him, and then—" And the Lord of Stoutenburg groaned aloud in the silence of the night, and paused in his restless walk. He drew a chair close to the table and sat down. Then, resting his elbows upon the table, he buried his head in his hands, and remained thus motionless, but breathing heavily, like one whose soul is fighting a losing battle. The minutes sped on. He had no means of gauging the time. It was just night, black, impenetrable night. From down below came the murmur of all the bustle that was going on, the clang of arms, the measured footsteps, which told of other alert human creatures who were waiting in excitement and tense expectancy for that dawn which still was far distant. The minutes sped on in the leaden feet of time. How long the Lord of Stoutenburg had sat thus, silent and absorbed, he could not afterwards have said. Perhaps after all he had fallen asleep, overcome with fatigue and with the constant sleeplessness of the past few days. But anon he was wide awake, slightly shivering with the cold. The tallow candle was spluttering, almost dying out. With a steady hand the Lord of Stoutenburg snuffed the smouldering wick. The candle flickered up again. Then he rose and quietly walked across the room. He pulled open the door and loudly called for Jan. A few minutes later Jan was at the door, silent, sullen, obedient as usual. "My lord called?" he asked. "Yes," replied Stoutenburg. "What hour is it?" "Somewhere near 6, I should say, my lord. I heard the clock tower at Ryswyk strike 5 some time ago." "How long is it before the dawn?" 2 hours, my lord." "Time to put up a gibbet, Jan, and to hang a man?" "Plenty of time for that, my lord," replied Jan quietly. "Then see to it, Jan, as speedily as you can. I feel that that man down below is our evil genius. While he lives chance will be against us. Of that I am as convinced as I am of the justice of our cause. If that man lives, Jan, the Stadtholder will escape us. I feel it in my bones. Something must have told me this in the night. It is a premonition that comes from above." "Then the man must not live, my lord," said Jan coldly. "You recognize that too, Jan, do you not?" rejoined Stoutenburg eagerly. "I am compelled in this, I won't say against my will, but compelled by a higher, a supernatural power. You too believe in the supernatural, do you not, my faithful Jan?" "I believe, my lord, first and foremost in the justice of our cause. I hate the Stadtholder and would see him dead. Nothing in the world must place that great aim of ours in jeopardy." Stoutenburg drew a deep breath of satisfaction. "Then see to the gibbet, my good Jan," he said in a firm, almost lusty voice. "Have it erected on the further side of the molens, so that the jongejuffrouw's eyes are not scandalized by the sight. When everything is ready, come and let me know, and guard him well until then. Jan, guard him with your very life. I want to see him hang, remember that. Come and tell me when the gallows are ready, and I'll go to see him hang. I want to see him hang." And Jan, without another word, salutes the Lord of Stoutenburg, and then goes out. And thus it is that a quarter of an hour later the silence of the night is broken by loud and vigorous hammering. Jan sees to it all, and a gibbet is not difficult to erect. Then men grumble, of course. They are soldiers and not executioners, and their hearts for the most have gone out to the merry compeer, the Laughing Cavalier, with his quaint jokes and his cheerful laugh. He has been sleeping soundly too for several hours, but now he is awake. Jan has told him that his last hour has come. Time to put up a gibbet with a few stiff planks taken from the storeroom of the molens and a length of rope. He looks round him quite carelessly. Bah! Death has no terrors for such a splendid soldier as he is. How many times hath he faced death ere this? Why, he was at Prague and at Magdeburg, where few escaped with their lives. He bears many a fine scar on that broad chest of his, and none upon his back. A splendid fighter, if ever there was one. But hanging? Bah! The men murmur audibly as plank upon plank is nailed. Jan directs operations, while Piet the Red keeps guard over the prisoner. 2 or 3 of the country louts know something of carpentering. They do the work under Jan's watchful eye. They grumble, but they work, for no one has been paid yet, and if you rebel you are like to be shot, and in any case you lose your pay. And Diogenes, leaning up against the beam, watches with lazy, quaintly smiling eyes the preparations that are going on not 100 paces away from him. After a while the darkness all around is beginning to yield to the slow insistence of dawn. It rises slowly behind the veils of mist which still envelop the distant east. Gradually an impalpable greyness creeps around the molens. Objects begin to detach themselves one by one out of the gloom. The moving figures of the mercenaries, the piles of arms heaped up here and there out of the damp, the massive beams, slimy and green, which support the molens, and a little further on the tall erection with a projecting arm round which great activity reigns. Diogenes watches it all with those same lazy eyes, and that same good-humoured smile lingering round his lips. That tall erection over there, which still looks ghost-like through the mist, is for him. The game of life is done, and he has lost. Death is there at the end of the projecting arm, on which even now Jan is fixing a rope. Death in itself matters but little, mused the philosopher with his gently ironical smile. I would have chosen another mode than hanging, but after all 'tis swift and sure, and of course now she will never know. Know what, O philosopher? What is it that she, Gilda, with the fair curls and the blue eyes, the proud firm mouth and round chin, what is it that she will never know? She will never know that a nameless, penniless soldier of fortune has loved her with every beat of his heart, every thought of his brain, and every sinew and every aspiration. She will never know that just in order to remain near her, when she was dragged away out of Rotterdam, he affronted deliberately the trap into which he fell. She will never know that for her dear sake he has borne humiliation, against which every nerve of his splendid nature did inwardly rebel, owning to guilt and shame lest her blue eyes shed tears for a brother's sin. She will never know that the warning to the Stadtholder came from him, and that he was neither a forger nor a thief, only just a soldier of fortune with a contempt for death, and an unspoken adoration for the one woman who seemed to him as distant from him as the stars. But there were no vain regrets in him now, no regret of life, for this he always held in his own hand, ready to toss it away for a fancy of an ideal. No regret of the might have been, because he was a philosopher, and the very moment that love for the unattainable was born in his heart, he had already realized that love to him could only mean a memory. Therefore, when he watched the preparations out there in the mist, and heard the heavy blows upon the wooden planks, and the murmurs of his sympathizers at their work, he only smiled gently, self-deprecatingly, but always good-humouredly. If the Chapter 38 of the Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 38. The Hour. A curiously timid voice roused the philosopher from his dreams. "Is there aught I can do for you, sir? Alas, my friend, the Lord Stoutenburg, is deeply angered against you. I could do nothing with him on your behalf." Diogenes turned his head in the direction whence had come the voice. He saw Nicholas Beresteyn standing there in the cold grey mist, with his fur cloak wrapped closely up to his chin, and his face showing above the cloak, white and drawn. The situation was not likely to escape Diogenes' irrepressible sense of humour. "Mynheer Beresteyn," he exclaimed, "Dondersteen! What brings your mightiness here at this hour? A man on the point of death, sir, has no call for so pitiable a sight as is your face just now." "I heard from my Lord Stoutenburg what happened in the hut last night," said Beresteyn in a faltering voice, and determined not to heed the other's bantering tone. "You exonerated me before my sister. Sir, this was a noble act." "I would wish to thank you." "And do so with quaking voice and shaking knees," quoth Diogenes with unalterable good humour, through which there pierced, however, an obvious undercurrent of contempt. "Ye gods!" he added with a quaint sigh, "these men have not even the courage of their infamy." The words, the tone, the shrug of the shoulders which accompanied these, stung Nicholas Beresteyn's dormant dignity to the quick. "I do not wonder," he said more firmly, "that you feel bitter contempt for me now. Your generosity, for which I did not crave, hath placed me momentarily at a disadvantage before you. Yet believe me, I would not be outdone by you in generosity were it not for my allegiance to the Lord Stoutenburg. I would go straight to my sister now and confess my guilt to her. You believe me, I trust," he added, seeing that Diogenes' merry eyes were fixed mockingly upon him. "Did fate allow it, I would gladly change places with you even now." "I am about to hang, sir," quoth Diogenes lightly. "Alas! And you are forced, you say, to play a craven's part. Believe me, sir, I would not change places with you for a kingdom." "I do believe you, sir," rejoined Beresteyn earnestly, "yet I would have you think of me as something less of a coward than I seem. Were I to make full confession to my sister now, I should break her heart, but it would not save your neck from the gallows. And a rogue's neck, sir, is of such infinitely less value than a good woman's heart. So I pray you say no more about it. Death and I are old acquaintances. Oft hath he nodded to me en passant. We are about to become closer friends, that is all. Some day my sister shall know, sir, all that you have done for her and for me." The ghost of a shadow passed over the Laughing Cavalier's face. "That, sir, I think had best remain twixt you and me for all times. But this I would have you know, that when I accepted the ignoble bargain which you proposed to me in my friend's hall studio, I did so because I thought that the jongejuffrouw would be safer in my charge then than in yours." Beresteyn was about to retort more hotly when Jan, closely followed by half a dozen men, came with swift, firm footsteps up to the prisoner. He saluted Beresteyn deferentially, as was his wont. "Your pardon, mynheer," he said. "My lord hath ordered that the prisoner be forthwith led to execution." Nicholas's pale face became the colour of lead. "One moment, Jan," he said, "one moment. I must speak with my lord." "My lord is with the jongejuffrouw," said Jan curtly. "Shall I send to tell him that you desire to speak with him?" No, that is, I," stammered Nicholas, who indeed was fighting a cruel battle with his own weakness, his own cowardice now. It was that weakness which had brought him to the abject pass in which he now stood, face to face with the man he had affected to despise, and who was about to die, laden with the crimes which he, Nicholas, had been the first to commit. Stoutenburg's influence over him had been paramount. Through it he had lost all sense of justice, of honour, and of loyalty. Banded with murderers, he had ceased to recognise the very existence of honesty, and now he was in such a plight morally that though he knew himself to be playing an ignoble role, he did not see the way to throw up the part, and to take up that of an honest man. One word from him to Gilda, his frank confession of his own guilt, and she would so know how to plead for the condemned man that Stoutenburg would not dare to proceed with this monstrous act. But that word he had not the courage to speak. With dull eyes and in sullen silence he watched Piet the Red untying, under Jan's orders, the ropes which held the prisoner to the beam, and then securing others to keep his arms pinioned behind his back. The mist now was of a faint silvery grey, and the objects around had that mysterious, hushed air which the dawn alone can lend. The men, attracted by the sight of a fellow creature in his last living moments, had gathered together in close knots of threes and fours. They stood by, glowering and sombre, and had not Jan turned a wilfully deaf ear to their murmurings, he would have heard many an ugly word spoken under their breath. These were of course troublous and fighting times, when every man's hand was against some other, when every able-bodied man was firstly a soldier, and then only a peaceable citizen. Nor was the present situation an uncommon one. The men could not know what the prisoner had done to deserve this summary punishment. He might have been a spy, an informer, or merely a prisoner of war. It was no soldier's place to interfere, only to obey orders and to ask no questions. But they gave to the splendid personality of the condemned man the tribute of respectful silence. whilst Jan secured the slender white hands of the prisoner, and generally made those awful preparations which even so simple a death as hanging doth demand, jests and oaths were stilled one by one among these rough fighting men. Not one head but was uncovered, not a back that was not straightened, not an attitude that was not one of deference and attention. Instinct, that unerring instinct of the soldier, had told them that here was no scamp getting his just reward, but a brave man going with a careless smile to his death. "Has Mynheer finished with the prisoner?" asked Jan, when he saw that Piet had finished his task, and that the prisoner was ready to be led away. "Is there aught your greatness would still desire to say to him?" "Only this," said Beresteyn firmly, "that were his hands free, I would ask leave to grasp them." A look of kindly amusement fell from the prisoner's eyes upon the pale face of the young man. "I have never known you, sir, save by a quaint nickname," continued Beresteyn earnestly, "but surely you have kith and kin somewhere. Have you no father or mother living whom you will leave to mourn?" The prisoner made no immediate reply. The smile of kindly amusement still lingered around his lips, but presently, with an instinctive gesture of pride, he threw back his head and looked around him, as one who has nothing to fear and but little to regret. He met the sympathetic glance cast on him by the man who had done him, and was still doing him, an infinite wrong, and all around those of his mute and humble friends, who seemed to be listening eagerly now for the answer which he would give to Mynheer. Then, with a quick sweep, his eyes suddenly rested on the wooden erection beyond the molens that loomed out so tragically through the mist, pointing with its one weird arm to some infinite distance far away. Something in the gentle pathos of this humble deference that encompassed him, something mayhap in the solemnity of that ghostly arm, suddenly seemed to melt the thin crust of his habitual flippancy. He looked back on Beresteyn and said softly, "I have a friend, Frans Hals, the painter of pictures. Tell him when next you see him that I am glad his portrait of me is finished, and that I asked God to bless him for all his goodness has meant to me in the past." "But your father, sir," urged Beresteyn, "your kindred." "My father, sir," replied Diogenes curtly, "would not care to hear that his son had died upon the gallows." Beresteyn would have spoken again, but Jan interposes once more, humbly but firmly. "My lord's orders," he now says briefly, "and time presses, Mynheer." Beresteyn stands back, smothering a sigh. Jan on ahead, then Piet the Red and the 6 soldiers with the prisoner between them. A few steps only divide them from the gruesome erection that looms more solidly now out of the mist. Beresteyn, wrapping his head up in his cloak to shut out sound and sight,
Chapter 39 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 39, Sauve Qui Peut. Then it is that out of the thickness of the fog a figure suddenly emerges, running and panting. A man has fallen up against the group of soldiers who have just halted beside the gibbet. "It is Lucas of Sparendam come back from Delft," they cry, as soon as they recognize the stained face, wet with frost and the mist. Already Jan, who with Piet's help was busy with the rope, has heard the name. His wan, thin face has become the colour of ashes. "Lucas of Sparendam come back from Delft," he murmurs. "The Lord save us all." Lucas of Sparendam was sent yesterday to Delft by the Lord of Stoutenburg to spy and to find out all that was going on inside the Princehof, where slept the Stadtholder and his bodyguard of 100 men-at-arms. And now he has come back running and panting, his clothes torn, his face haggard and spent. He has run all the way from Delft, a matter of 1.5 leagues. Why should a man half kill himself by endeavouring to cover 1.5 leagues in 1 hour? A drop of hot wine for Lucas, cries one of the soldiers. He is faint. The other men, there are close to 40 all told, crowd around the gibbet now. Those in charge of the prisoner have much ado to keep the space clear. They don't say anything just yet, but there is a strange restless look in their eyes, and their lips tremble with all the unspoken questions. Only 2 men remain calm and silent. Jan has never ceased in his task of adjusting the ropes, and the prisoner stands quite still, bound with cords, and neither looking on Lucas nor yet on the gibbet above him. His eyes were half closed, and there was a strained look on his merry face, as if he were trying to listen to something that was too far off to hear. But one man in the meanwhile is ready with the bottle of spiced wine, the best cordial there is for a fainting man. The others make way for him so that he can minister to Lucas, and Lucas drinks the wine eagerly, then opens his eyes. "We are betrayed," he murmurs. "Great God!" exclaims Jan dully. "Betrayed? What does it mean?" No one heeds the prisoner now. They all crowd around Lucas. Jan calls out his orders in vain. Piet the Red alone listens to what he says. The others all want to know what Lucas means. They had been in the thick of the plot, of course. They all knew that a quoa pens had been prepared by the Lord of Stoutenburg for the Stadtholder whom he hates. The heavy boxes, of course, gunpowder to blow up the wooden bridge when the Stadtholder and his escorts are halfway across. Of course they all guessed it, thought on it all through the night, while they polished the arms, the swords and the pistols and the cullivers which had been served out to them. They had guessed, of course, the foreign mercenaries who were always in the thick of every conspiracy, and well paid for being so. They had been the first to guess, and they had told the country louts, who only grinned, enjoying the prospect of the fun. But now they were betrayed. Lucas of Sparendam had come back with the news, and even Jan stopped in his hideous task in order to listen to what he had to say. "It all happened yesterday," quoth Lucas as soon as he had recovered his breath. "The rumour began in the tower quarters of the town. Nobody knows who began it. Some say that a foreigner came into the city in the early morning and sat down at one of the taverns to eat and drink with the prince's soldiers." A foreigner? Jan turns to look on the prisoner and encounters his mocking glance. Smothering a curse, he resumes his task of adjusting the rope upon the gibbet, but his fingers are unsteady, and his work doth not progress. "Yes, a foreigner," continued Lucas volubly, "though it all has remained very mysterious. The prince's soldiers spoke of it amongst themselves. The foreigner had said something about a quoa pens, a plot against the Stadtholder's life on his way to the north. Then one of the officers heard the rumour and carried it to one of his superiors. By the evening it had reached the Stadtholder's ears." "Then what happened?" they all asked eagerly. "Nothing for some hours," replied Lucas, "but I know that spies were sent round in every direction, and at by midnight there was general talk in the city that the Stadtholder would not continue his journey to the north. When the captain of the guard came to him for orders, the prince said curtly, 'We do not start tomorrow.' As soon as I heard of this I made preparations. It was then an hour after midnight. I was still alert and listening. All around me, as I made ready to leave the city, I heard rumors among the soldiers and spies of the Stadtholder, of their knowledge of a lonely spot, a deserted molens near Ryswyk, where they declared many men did lately congregate. I heard too that soon after dawn the prince's guard would make straight for the molens, so I put on my snowshoes and started to run, despite the darkness and the fog, for we are all betrayed, and the Stadtholder's soldiers will be on us in a trice. Hardly are the words out of Lucas Sparendam's mouth than the commotion begins, the disbanding. There is a roar and a bustle, and a buzz, metal clashing, men rushing, cries of, "We are betrayed, Sauve Qui Peut." At first there is a general stampede for the places where the arms are kept, the muskets, the swords, and the cullivers, but these are thrown down almost as soon as they are picked up. They are no use now, and worse than useless in a flight. But pistols are useful in a case of pursuit. Quick, turn, fire. So where are the pistols? Jan, where are the pistols? There are not enough to go around. About a dozen were served out last night, and there are 40 pairs of hands determined to possess one at least. So they begin to fight for them, tearing one another to pieces, shouting execrations, beating round with bare fists, since the other arms have already been laid down. Now the confusion becomes worse than any fight that might reign among a herd of animals, who are ready to rend one another. They tear the clothes off another's back, the skin off another's face. Fear, hideous, overwhelming, abject fear, has made wild beasts of these men. The mist envelops them. It is barely light in this basement beneath the molens. Lanthorns have long ago been kicked into extinction. The hot breath of 40 panting throats mingles with the mist, and the heat of human bodies, fever heated with passion, fights against the strength of the frost. The frozen ground yields under the feet. Clots of mud are thrown up by the stampede. From the beams up aloft the heavy icicles melt and drip monotonously, incessantly down upon those faces, red and perspiring in that agony of demented fear. Jan and Piet the Red stand alone beside the prisoner. A sense of duty, of decency, hath kept their blood cool, until they are relieved from their post of guarding this man by orders from their lord. They will not move. Let the others rage and scream and tumble over one another. There must be at least a few soldiers among this rabble. And the prisoner looks on all this confusion with eyes that dance and sparkle with the excitement of what is yet to come. Torn rags and broken accoutrements soon lie in a litter in the mud, trampled in by 40 pairs of feet. There is not one face now that is not streaked with blood, not one throat that is not hoarse with terror, the terror of the unknown. In vain Jan from his post beside the prisoner shouts, harangues, appeals, threatens. A fight? Yes. Defeat? Why not? But betrayal? No, no, let's away. The Stadtholder is fiercer than any inquisitor of Spain. His cruelty last February almost turned the nation against him. But now this second conspiracy, Stoutenburg again? What hope for his followers? The horrors of last February, perpetrated in the Gevangen port of Esgravenhage, still cause many a rough cheek to blanch at their recollection. Men had gone mad who had heard the cries which pierced those stone walls then. One executioner had thrown down his bloody tools and fled from the place like one possessed. Jan van Dyck and Kornwinder, Slaughter, and the rest had been in hell ere a merciful death at last released them from the barbaric cruelty of the Prince of Orange. No, no, such a fate cannot be risked. We are betrayed. Let us fly." Suddenly one man starts to run. "I am for the coasts," he shouts, and incontinently takes to his heels. Sauve Qui Peut! Like irresponsible creatures, they throw down the very weapons for which they have been fighting. The one man has given the signal for the run. Everything now is thrown aside. There is no thought save for flight. A splashing of the mud, a general shout, a scramble, a clatter, they run, crying to those who are behind them to follow and to run too. In 5 minutes the dark basement is clear of noise. A litter of broken arms lies in one heap close by. Others are scattered all over the ground in the mud, together with torn clothing, rags of leather and of cloth, and great red pools that mingle with the melted ice. The mist surrounds it all, this abandoned battlefield wherein fear was the victor over man. The swiftly flying figures are soon swallowed up by the grey wall which lies dense and heavy over the low land around. For a time they appear like ghosts with blurred outlines of torn doublets and scraps of felt hats placed awry. Then the outline gets more dim as they run, and the kindly mist hides them from view. Under the molens all is silent now. Jan and Piet the Red guard the prisoner alone. The gallows are ready, or nearly so, but there is no one to send to the Lord of Stoutenburg to tell him this, as he hath commanded, so that he may see this man hang whom he hates. And it would not be safe to leave the prisoner unguarded. Only from time to time Jan looks to see that the ropes still hold fast. But for the most part his eyes are fixed upon the mist on his left, for that way lies Delft, and from thence will loom out by and by the avenging horde sent by the Prince of Orange. Now that those panting, perspiring human creatures have gone, the frost is more bitter, more biting than before. But neither Piet nor Jan seem to heed it, though their flesh is blue with the cold. Overhead there is a tramp of feet. The noble mynheers must have heard the confusion. They must have seen the flight. They are even now preparing to do in a slightly more dignified way what the foreign mercenaries and the louts from the country have done so incontinently. The prisoner, hearing this tramp of feet over his head, looks more alertly around him. He sees that Jan and Piet have remained on guard even whilst the others have fled. He also sees the pile of heaped up arms, the broken metal, the rags and the mud, and through the intricacies of the wooden steps, the booted feet of the mynheers running helter-skelter down, and a mad, merry laugh that holds a world of joy in its rippling tones breaks from his lips. The next moment, from far away, comes a weird cry through the mist. A fox on the alert tries to lure his prey with that quaint cry of his, which appeals to the young birds and encourages them to come. What should a fox be doing on these ice-covered tracks? He must have strayed from very far, from over the moor mayhap beyond Gonda. Hunger no doubt hath made a wanderer of him, an exile from his home. Jan listens, greatly astonished. What should a fox be doing here? Piet is impassive. He knows nothing of the habits of foxes. Sea-wolves are more familiar to him. With his eyes Jan instinctively questions the prisoner. What should a fox be doing here on these ice-bound flats? He mutely asks. But the prisoner apparently cares nothing about the marvels of nature, cares nothing about exiled foxes. His head is erect, his eyes dance with glee. A happy smile lights up his entire face. Jan remembered that the others last night had called the wounded man the Laughing Cavalier. A cavalier he looked, every inch of him. The ropes mattered nothing, nor the torn clothing. Proud, triumphant, happy, he was laughing with all the light-hearted gaiety which pertains to youth. Laughing Cavalier, forsooth! Lucky devil! If he can laugh,
Chapter 40 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 40. The Loser Pays. Nicholas Beresteyn had not gone far when Lucas of Sparendam came running with the news. He heard it all. He saw the confusion, the first signs of Sauve Qui Peut. At first he was like one paralyzed with horror and with fear. He could not move. His limbs refused him service. Then he thought of his friends, some up in the molens, others at various posts on the road and by the bridge. They might not hear the confusion and the tumult. They might not see the coming Sauve Qui Peut. They might not hear that the Stadtholder's spies are on the alert, and that his bodyguard might be here at any time. Just then the disbanding began. Nicholas Beresteyn pushed his way through the fighting, quarrelling crowd to where Lucas of Sparendam, still exhausted and weak, was leaning up against a beam. "Their lordships up in the molens," he said in a voice still choked with fear, "and the Lord of Stoutenburg in the hut with the jongejuffrouw. Come and tell them at once all that you know." And he dragged Lucas of Sparendam in his wake. The Lord of Stoutenburg was at Gilda's feet when Beresteyn ran in with Lucas to tell him the news. After he had given Jan the orders to prepare the gallows for the summary execution of the prisoner, he had resumed his wild, restless pacing up and down the room. There was no remorse in him for his inhuman and cowardly act, but his nerves were all on the jar, and that perpetual hammering which went on in the distance drove him to frantic exasperation. A picture of the happenings in the basement down below would obtrude itself upon his mental vision. He saw the prisoner, careless, contemptuous, ready for death; Jan sullen but obedient; the men murmuring and disaffected. He felt as if the hammering was now directed against his own head. He could have screamed aloud with the agony of this weary, expectant hour. Then he thought of Gilda. Slowly the dawn was breaking. The hammering had ceased momentarily. Silence reigned in the basement after the turbulence of the past hour. The Lord of Stoutenburg did not dare conjecture what this silence meant. The thought of Gilda became more insistent. He snatched up a cloak, and wrapping it closely round him, he ran out into the mist. Quickly descending the steps, he at once turned his back on the basement, where the last act of the supreme tragedy would be enacted presently. He felt like a man pursued, with the angel of Nemesis close to his heels, hourglass in hand to mark the hour of retribution. He hoped to find rest and peace beside Gilda. He would not tell her that he had condemned the man to death. Let her forget him peaceably and naturally. The events of to-day would surely obliterate other matters from her mind. What was the life of a foreign vagabond beside the destinies of Holland, which an avenging God would help to settle to-day? The Lord of Stoutenburg had walked rapidly to the hut, where he hoped to find Gilda ready to receive him. He knocked at the door, and Maria opened it to him. To his infinite relief, she told him that the jongejuffrouw had broken her fast, and would gladly speak with him. Gilda, he thought, looked very pale and fragile in the dim light of 2 or 3 tallow candles placed in sconces about the room. There were dark circles around her eyes, and a pathetic trembling of her lips proclaimed the near presence of tears. But there was an atmosphere of peace in the tiny room, with its humble little bits of furniture, and the huge earthenware stove, from which the pleasing glow of a wood fire emanated, and shed a cheerful radiance around. The Lord of Stoutenburg felt that here in Gilda's presence he could forget his ambitions and his crimes, the man whom he was so foully putting to death, his jealousies, and even his revenge. He drew a low chair close to her, and half sitting, half kneeling, began speaking to her as gently, as simply as his harsh voice and impatient temperament would allow. He spoke mostly about the future, only touching very casually on the pain which she had caused him by her unjust suspicions of him. Gilda listened to him in silence for a while. She was collecting all her will-power, all her strength of purpose, for the task which lay before her, the task of softening a hardened and treacherous heart, of rousing in it a spark of chivalry and of honour, so that it showed mercy there where it now threatened injustice, cruelty, and almost inhuman cowardice. A brave man's life was in the hands of this man, who professed love for her, and though Gilda rejected that love with contempt, she meant, womanlike, to use that love as a mainspring for the softened mood which she wished to call forth. The first thought that had broken in upon her after a brief and troubled sleep was that a brave young life would be sacrificed today to gratify the petty spite of a fiend. She had been persuaded yesterday that the man who, though helpless and pinioned, stood before her in all the splendour of manhood and of a magnificent personality, was nothing but a common criminal, a liar, a forger, and a thief. Though this thought should have made her contented, since by bringing guilt home to a man who was nothing to her, it exonerated her brother whom she loved, she had felt all night, right through the disturbing dreams which had floated through her consciousness, a leaden weight sitting upon her heart, like the sense of the committal of some great and irreparable wrong. Indeed, she felt that if here in this very place, which he had filled last night with his exuberant vitality, she had to think of him as silent and cold for all eternity, such a thought would drive her mad. The Lord of Stoutenburg's honeyed words fell unheeded on her ear. His presence near her filled her with horror. She only kept up a semblance of interest in him because he held the fate of another man in the hollow of his hand. She was preparing in her mind what she was going to say to him. She rehearsed the words which were most likely to appeal to his callous nature. Already she was nerving herself for the supreme effort of pleading for a brave man's life, when suddenly the tramping of heavy feet outside the hut, confused shouts and clang of arms, caused Stoutenburg to jump to his feet. The door was torn open, and Nicholas Beresteyn stood for a moment on the threshold, pale, speechless, with body trembling and moisture thick upon his brow. Lucas of Sparendam was close behind him, equally pale and still. At first sight of her brother, Gilda had uttered a little cry of joy, but that cry soon died upon her lips. Beresteyn had scarcely looked on her. His glance at once had found that of Stoutenburg, and the two men seemed to understand one another. "We are betrayed?" cried Stoutenburg hoarsely. Beresteyn nodded in reply. "How?" Lucas of Sparendam, in short jerky sentences, retold once more the tale of all that had happened at Delft. The Prince of Orange warned, the spies which he had sent broadcast, the bodyguard which even now was on its way. "They know of this place," murmured Beresteyn between quivering lips. "They might be here at any moment." Through the open door there came the noise of the men fighting, the cries of rage and of fear, the clatter of metal and the tramping of many feet. "They are scared and half mad," said Lucas of Sparendam. "In 5 minutes the Sauve Qui Peut will commence." "We are quite near the coast," said Stoutenburg with outward calm. though his voice was choked, and his tongue clove to the roof of his mouth. "Go you and tell the others, Beresteyn," he added, turning to his friend. "Then collect all our papers that are in the molens. Thank God there are only a few that might compromise us at all. Heemskerk and Van Does will help you. They are not like to be seized with panic. We can then make quietly for Scheveningen, where the boats are ready. There is a sledge here and a pair of horses which I shall need, but it is less than a league to Scheveningen, and you can all walk it easily. Tell the others not to lose time, and I will follow with the sledge as soon as may be. There is no cause for a panic, and we can all save ourselves." Beresteyn made ready to go. He took less pains than Stoutenburg to conceal his terror, and his knees frankly shook under him. At the door he paused. He had suddenly remembered Gilda. She had risen from her chair, and stood now like a statue carved in stone, white to the lips, wide-eyed, her whole expression one of infinite horror. It had all been lies then, all that Stoutenburg had told her yesterday. He had concealed the monstrous truth, lying to her with every word he uttered. Now he stood there pale and trembling, the traitor who in his turn had been betrayed. Fear and blind rage were fighting their last deathly battle in his soul. The edifice of his treachery was crumbling round him. God's hand, through an unknown channel, had set the limit to his crimes. Twice a traitor, he had twice failed. Already he could see the disbanding of his mercenary troops, the beginning of that mad, wild flight to the coast, and down the steps of the molens his friends too were running helter-skelter, without thought of anything save of their own safety. It would be so immeasurably horrible to fall into the Stadtholder's hands. And Gilda, pale and silent, stood between the two men who had lied to her, outraged her to the end. Nicholas was a traitor after all. He had cast the eternal shroud of shame over the honour and peace of his house, and God did not help him now. His death would complete that shame. She tried to hold his glance, but he would not look at her. She felt that his wrath of her almost bordered on hatred, because he believed that she had betrayed them all. His eyes were fixed upon his leader and friend, and all the anxiety which he felt was for that one man. "You must not delay, Nicholas," said Stoutenburg curtly. "Go, warn the others, and tell them to make for Scheveningen. But do you wait for me. We'll follow anon in the sledge, and of course Gilda comes with us." And Beresteyn said firmly, "Of course Gilda comes with us." She was not afraid, even when he said this, even when his fierce glance rested upon her, and she was too proud to make an appeal to him. It was her turn now to avert her glance from him. To the bottom of her soul she loathed his cowardice, and the contempt with which she regarded him now was almost cruel in its intensity. He went out of the room, followed by Lucas of Sparendam, and now she was once more alone with the Lord of Stoutenburg. "Gilda," he cried with a fierce oath, "when did you do this?" "It was not I, my lord," she replied calmly. "You and Nicholas did all that lay in your power to render me helpless in this. God knows I would not have betrayed you. It is his hand that hath pointed the way to one who was more brave than I." "'Tis false," he exclaimed violently. "No one knew of our plan save those who must now flee because like us they have been betrayed. No sane man would wilfully put his head in the halter, and there are no informers amongst us." "You need not believe me, my lord," she rejoined coldly, "and you do not wish. But remember that I have never learnt the art of lying, nor could I be the Judas to betray my own brother. Therefore do I pledge you my word that I had no share in this decree of God." "If not yourself," he retorted, "you spoke of it to some one, who went to the Stadtholder and warned him. To some one who... Ah!" he cried suddenly with a loud and ghoulish scream, wherein rage, horror, and fear, and a kind of savage triumph too, rang out. "I see that I have guessed aright. You did speak of what you knew, to the miserable knave whom Nicholas paid to outrage you, and you offered him money to betray your own brother. "It is false." "It is true. I can read it in your face. That man went to Delft yesterday. He was captured by Jan on his way back to Rotterdam. He had fulfilled your errand and warned the Prince of Orange, and delivered me and all my friends into hands that never have shown mercy. He was blind with passion now, and looked on her with bloodshot eyes that threatened to kill. But Gilda was not cast in the same mould as was this traitor. Baffled in his crime, fear had completely unmanned him, but with every cry of rage uttered by Stoutenburg she became more calm and less afraid. "Once more, my lord," she said quietly in the brief interval of Stoutenburg's ravings, and while he was forced to draw breath, "do I pledge my word to you that I had no hand in saving the Stadtholder's life. That God chose for this another instrument than I do thank him on my knees." While she spoke, Stoutenburg had made a quick effort to regain some semblance of composure, and now he contrived to say quite calmly, and with an evil sneer upon his face, "That instrument of God is, an I mistake not, tied to a post with ropes like an ox ready for the butcher's hand. Though I have but sorry chances of escape myself, and every minute hath become precious, I can at least spend 5 in making sure that his fate at any rate be sorrier than mine." Her face became, if possible, even paler than before. "What do you mean to do?" she murmured. "The man who has betrayed me to the Prince of Orange is the same man who laid hands upon you in Haarlem. Is that not so?" "I cannot say," she said firmly. "The same man who was here in this room yesterday, bound and pinioned before you?" he insisted. "I do not know." "Will you swear then that you never spoke to him of the Prince of Orange and of our plans?" "Not of your plans," she protested calmly. "You see that you cannot deny it, Gilda," he continued with that same unnatural calm which seemed to her far more terrible than his rage had been before. "Willingly or unwittingly you let that man know what you overheard in the Grootkirk on New Year's Eve. Then you bribed him into warning the Prince of Orange, since you could not do it yourself." "It is false," she reiterated wildly. Once more that evil sneer distorted his pale face. "Well," he said, "whether you bribed him or not matters to me but little. I do believe that willingly you would not have betrayed Nicholas or me or any of our friends to the Stadtholder, knowing what he is. But you wanted to cross our plans, you wanted to warn the Stadtholder of his danger, and you, not God, chose that man for your instrument." "It is not true. I deny it," she repeated fearlessly. "You may deny it with words, Gilda, but your whole attitude proclaims the truth. Thank God," he cried with a note of savage triumph in his voice, "that man is still a helpless prisoner in my hands." "What do you mean?" she murmured. "I mean that it is good to hold the life of one's deadliest enemy in the hollow of one's hand." "But you would not slay a defenceless prisoner," she cried. He laughed, a bitter, harsh, unnatural laugh. "Slay him?" he cried. "Aye, that I will, if it is not already done. Did you hear the hammering and the knocking a while ago? It was Jan making ready the gibbet. And now, though the men have run away like so many Vendôme cowards, I know that Jan, at any rate, has remained faithful to his post. The gibbet is still there, and Jan and I and Nicholas, we have 3 pairs of hands between us, strong enough to make an enemy swing 'twixt earth and heaven, and 3 pairs of eyes herewith to see an informer perish upon the gallows." But already she had interrupted him with a loud cry of overwhelming horror. "Are you a fiend to think of such a thing?" "No," he replied, "only a man who has a wrong to avenge." "The wrong was in your treachery," she retorted, even while indignation nearly choked the words in her throat. No honest man could refuse to warn another that a murderous trap had been laid for him. "Possibly, but through that warning given by a man whom I hate, my life is practically at an end." "Life can only be ended by death," she pleaded, "and yours is in no danger yet. In a couple of hours, as you say, you will have reached the coast. No doubt you have taken full measures for your safety. The Stadtholder is sick. He hath scarce a few months to live. When he dies everything will be forgotten. You can return and begin your life anew. Oh, you will thank God then on your knees that this last hideous crime doth not weigh upon your soul." "A wrong unavenged would weigh my soul down with bitterness," he said sombrely. "My life is done, Gilda. Ambition, hope, success, everything that I care for has gone from me. Nicholas may begin his life anew. He is young, and his soul is not like mine, consumed with ambition and with hatred. But for that one man I were to-day Stadtholder of half our provinces and sole ruler of our united Netherlands, instead of which from this hour forth I shall be a fugitive, a pariah, an exile. All this do I owe to one man," he added fiercely, "and I take my revenge. That is all." He made a feint as if to go, but Gilda, with a moan of anguish, had already held him back. Despite the loathing which the slightest contact with such a fiend caused her, she clung with both her hands to his arm. "My lord," she entreated, "in the name of your dear mother, in the name of all that is yet good and pure and noble in you, do not allow this monstrous crime to add to the heavy load of sin which rests upon your soul. God is just," she added earnestly. "God will punish us all if such an infamy is done now, at this supreme hour, when our destinies are being weighed in the balance." But he looked down on her suddenly, with an evil leer which sent a chill right through her to her heart. "Are you pleading for a man who mayhap hath sent your brother to the scaffold?" he asked. His glance was now so dark and so cruel, the suspicion which lurked in it was so clear, that for the moment Gilda was overawed by this passion of hate and jealousy which she was unable to fathom. The quick hot blood of indignation rushed to her pale cheeks. "It was of Nicholas that I was thinking," she said proudly. "If that man dies now, I feel that such a dastardly crime would remain a lasting stain upon the honour of our house." "The crime is on you, Gilda," he retorted, "in that you did betray us all. Willingly or unwittingly, you did deliver me into the hands of my most bitter enemy. But I pray you, plead no more for a knave, whom you surely must hate even more bitterly than I do hate him. The time goes by, and every wasted minute becomes dangerous now. I pray you make ready yourself to depart." She had not given up all thoughts of pleading yet, though she knew that for the moment she had failed. There floated vaguely at the back of her mind a dim hope that God would not abandon her in this her bitterest need. He had helped her in her direst trouble. He had averted the hideous treachery which threatened to stain her father's honoured name and her own with a hideous mark of shame. Surely he would not allow this last, most terrible crime to be committed. No doubt that vague frame of mind, born of intense bodily and mental fatigue, betrayed itself in the absent expression in her eyes, for Stoutenburg reiterated impatiently, "I can give you a quarter of an hour wherein to make ready." "A quarter of an hour," she murmured vaguely. "To make ready? For what?" "For immediate departure with me and your brother for Belgium." Still she did not understand. A deep frown of puzzlement appeared between her brows. "Departure? With you? What do you mean, my lord?" she asked. "I mean," he replied roughly, "that out of the wreckage of all my ambitions, my desires, and my hopes, I will at least save something that will compensate me for all that I have lost. You said just now that life could only end in death. Well, next to mine ambition and my desire for vengeance, you, Gilda, as you know, do fill my entire soul. With you beside me I may try to begin life anew. I leave for the coast in less than half an hour. Nicholas will be with us, and he will care for you. But I will not go without you, so you must come with us." "Never," she said firmly. But Stoutenburg only laughed with careless mockery. "Who will protect you," he said, "when I take you in my arms and carry you to the sledge? which in a quarter of an hour will be ready for you? Who will protect you when I carry you in my arms from the sledge to the boat which awaits us at Scheveningen?" "Nicholas," she rejoined calmly, "is my brother. He would not permit such an outrage." An ironical smile curled the corners of his cruel lips. "Do you really think, Gilda," he said, "that Nicholas will run counter to my will? I have but to persuade him that your presence in Holland will be a perpetual menace to our safety. Besides, you heard what he said just now, that you, of course, would come with us." "My dead body you can take with you," she retorted, "but I, alive, will never follow you." "Then 'tis your dead body I'll take, Gilda," he said with a sneer. "I will be here to fetch you in a quarter of an hour, so I pray you make ready while I go to deal with that meddlesome instrument of God." She was spent now, and had no strength for more. A great numbness, an overpowering fatigue, seemed to creep into her limbs. She even allowed him to take her hand and to raise it to his lips, for she was quite powerless to resist him. Only when she felt those burning lips against her flesh, a shudder of infinite loathing went right through her body. Soon he turned on his heel and strode out of the room. She heard the thin wooden door fall to with a bang behind him, but she could no longer see. A kind of darkness had fallen over her eyes, a darkness in which only one figure appeared clearly, the figure of a man upon a gibbet. All else was blackness around her, impenetrable blackness, almost tangible in its intensity, and out of the blackness, which seemed like that of a dungeon, there came cries as of human creatures in hell. "Lord, have mercy upon him!" Her lips, cold and white, murmured vaguely and insistently, "Lord, have mercy." Chapter 41 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 41. Vengeance is Mine. It was like a man possessed of devils that the Lord of Stoutenburg ran out through the mist toward the molens. The grey light of this winter's morning had only vaguely pierced the surrounding gloom, and the basement beneath the molens still looked impenetrably dark. Dark and silent. The soldier, foreign mercenaries and louts, had vanished in the fog. Arms hastily thrown down littered the mud-covered ground. Swords, pistols, muskets, torn clothing, here and there a neckcloth, a steel bonnet, a bright-coloured sash. Stoutenburg saw it all, right through the gloom, and he ground his teeth together to smother a cry of agonized impotence. Only now and then a ghostly form flitted swift and silent among the intricate maze of beams, a laggard left behind in the general scramble for safety, or a human scavenger on the prowl for loot. Now and then a groan or a curse came from out of the darkness, and a weird, shapeless, moving thing would crawl along in the mud like some creeping reptile seeking its lair. But Stoutenburg looked neither to the right nor left. He paid no heed to these swiftly fleeting ghost-like forms. He knew well enough that he would find silence here, that 36 men, cowards and mercenaries all, had been scattered like locusts before a gale. Overhead he heard the tramping of feet. His friends, Beresteyn, Heemskerk, Van Does, were making ready for flight. His one scheme of vengeance, that for which he had thirsted and plotted and sinned, had come to naught. But he had yet another in his mind, one which, if successful, would give him no small measure of satisfaction for the failure of the other. And ahead the outline of the hastily improvised gallows detached itself out of the misty shroud, and from the Lord of Stoutenburg's throat there came a fierce cry of joy, which surely must have delighted all the demons in hell. He hurried on, covering with swift, eager steps the short distance that separated him from the gibbet. He called loudly to Jan, for it seemed to him as if the place was unaccountably deserted. He could not see Jan nor yet the prisoner, and surely Piet the Red had not proved a coward. The solid beams above and around him threw back his call in reverberating echoes. He called again, and from far away a mocking laugh seemed alone to answer him. Like a frightened beast now he bounded forward. There were the gallows not 5 paces away from him. The planks hastily hammered together a while ago were creaking weirdly, buffeted by the wind, and up aloft the rope was swinging, beating itself with a dull, eerie sound against the wood. The Lord of Stoutenburg, dazed and stupefied, looked on this desolate picture like a man in a dream. "My lord!" The voice came feebly from somewhere close by. "My lord, for pity's sake!" It was Jan's voice, of course. The Lord of Stoutenburg turned mechanically in the direction from whence it came. Not far from where he was standing, he saw Jan lying on the ground against a beam, with a scarf wound loosely round his mouth, and his arms held with a cord behind his back. Stoutenburg unwound the scarf and untied the cord, then he murmured dully, "Jan, what does this mean?" "The men all threw down their arms, my lord," said Jan as soon as he had struggled to his feet. "They ran like cowards when Lucas of Sparendam brought the news." "I knew that," said Stoutenburg hoarsely. "Curse them all for their miserable cowardice." "But the prisoner, man, the prisoner, what have you done with him? Did I not order you to guard him with your life?" "Then is mine own life forfeit, my lord," said Jan simply, "for I did fail in guarding the prisoner." A violent oath broke from Stoutenburg's trembling lips. He raised his clenched fist, ready to strike, in his blind, unreasoning fury, the one man who had remained faithful to him to the last. Jan slowly bent the knee. "Kill me, my lord," he said calmly. "I could not guard the prisoner." Stoutenburg was silent for a moment. Then his upraised arm fell nervelessly by its side. "How did it happen?" he asked. "I scarce can tell you, my lord," replied Jan. "The attack on us was so quick and sudden. Piet and I did remain at our post, but in the rush and the panic we presently were left alone beside the prisoner. 2 men, who were his friends, must have been on the watch for this opportunity. They fell on us from behind and caught us unawares. We called in vain for assistance. It was a case of Sauve Qui Peut, and every one for himself. In a trice the cords that bound the prisoner were cut, and 3 men had very quickly the best of us. Piet, though wounded in the leg, contrived to escape, but it almost seemed as if those 3 demons were determined to spare me. Though by God," added Jan fervently, "I would gladly have died rather than have seen all this shame." When they had brought me down, they wound a scarf round my mouth and left me here tied to a beam, while they disappeared in the fog. Stoutenburg made no comment on this brief narrative. Even the power of cursing seemed to have deserted him. He left Jan kneeling there on the frozen ground, and without a word he turned on his heel and made his way once more between the beams under the molens back toward the hut. Vengeance indeed had eluded his grasp. The 2 men whom on earth he hated most had remained triumphant, while he himself had been brought down to the lowest depths of loneliness and misery. Friendless, kinless now, life indeed, as he had told Gilda, was at an end for him. Baffled vengeance would henceforth make him a perpetual exile, and a fugitive, with every man's hand raised against him, a price once more upon his head. The world doth at times allow a man to fail in the task of his life. It will forgive that one failure, and allow the man to try again. But a second failure is unforgivable. Men turn away from the blunderer in contempt. Who would risk life, honour, and liberty in a cause that has twice failed? Stoutenburg knew this. He knew that within the hour his friends would already have practically deserted him. Panic-stricken now, they would accompany him as far as the coast. They would avail themselves of all the measures which he had devised for their mutual safety, but in their innermost hearts they would already have detached themselves from his future ill fortunes, and anon, in a few months mayhap, when the Stadtholder had succumbed to the disease which was threatening his life, they would all return to their homes and to their kindred, and forget this brief episode, wherein their leader's future had been so completely and so irretrievably wrecked. They would forget, only he, Stoutenburg, would remain the pariah, the exile, that carries the brand of traitor for ever upon the pages of his life. And now the hut is once more in sight, and for one brief instant an inward light flickers up in Stoutenburg's dulled eyes. Gilda is there, Gilda whom he loves, and whose presence in the sorrow-laden years that are to come would be a perpetual compensation for all the humiliation and all the shame which he had endured. To-day, mayhap she would follow him unwillingly, but Stoutenburg's passion was proof against her coldness. He felt that he could conquer her, that he could win her love, when once he had her all to himself in a distant land, when she, kinless too and forlorn, would naturally turn to him for protection and for love. He had little doubt that he would succeed, and vaguely in his mind there rose the pale ray of hope that her love would then bring him luck, or at any rate put renewed
Chapter 42 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 42, The Fight in the Doorway. It seemed to Stoutenburg that from the back of the hut there came the sound of bustle and activity. He thought that mayhap Beresteyn had had the good idea of making the sled ready for departure, and he called out loudly to his friend. It was a mocking voice, however, that rose in response. "Was your magnificence, perchance, looking for me?" Out of the mist which still hung around the small building, Diogenes' tall figure suddenly loomed before the Lord of Stoutenburg. He was standing in the doorway of the hut with his back to it. One hand, the right one, was thrust inside his doublet. The left was on the hilt of his sword. His battered hat was tilted rakishly above his brow, and he was regarding his approaching enemy with a look of keen amusement and scorn. At first Stoutenburg thought that his fevered fancy was playing his eyes a weird and elusive trick. Then, as the reality of what he saw fully burst upon his senses, he uttered a loud and hoarse cry, like a savage beast that has been wounded. "Plepshark, smearlap," he cried fiercely, "rogue, villain, menial varlet, and all that you care to name me, my lord," quoth the philosopher lightly, "and entirely at your service." "Jan!" cried Stoutenburg. "Jan, in the name of hell, where are you?" "Not very far, my lord," rejoined the other. Jan is a brave soldier, but he was no match for the three philosophers, even though one of them at first was trussed like a fowl. Jan stuck to his post, my lord. Remember that," he added more seriously, "even when your other followers and friends were scattered to the winds, like a crowd of mice at the approach of a cat. We did not hurt Jan because he is a brave soldier, but we tied him down lest he ran to get assistance, whilst assistance was still available. You insolent knave!" "You speak rightly, my lord. I am an insolent knave, and do rejoice in mine insolence, that I stayed behind here while my brother philosophers accomplished the task which I had put upon them on purpose. to exercise some of that insolence upon you, and to see what power a man hath to curb his temper, and to look pleasant, whilst an insolent knave doth tell him to his face that he is an abject and degraded cur." "Then, by heaven, you abominable plepshurk," cried Stoutenburg, white with passion, "since you stayed here to parley with me, I can still give you so complete a retort that your final insolence will have to be spoken in hell. But let me pass now, I have business inside the hut." "I know you have, my lord," rejoined Diogenes coolly, "but I am afraid that your business will have to wait until two philosophers named respectively Pythagoras and Socrates have had time to finish theirs." "What do you mean? Let me pass, I tell you, or the wrath of your magnificence will once more be upon mine unworthy head. Dondersteen, what have I not suffered already from that all-powerful wrath? You should have been hanged ere this. It is an omission, my lord, which I fear me we must now leave to the future to rectify." "Stand aside, man," cried Stoutenburg, who was hoarse with passion. "No, not just yet," was the other's calm reply. "Stand aside," reiterated Stoutenburg wildly. He drew his sword and made a quick thrust at his enemy. He remembered the man's wounded shoulder, and saw that his right hand was temporarily disabled. "Ah, my lord," quoth Diogenes lightly, as with his left he drew Bucephalus out of its scabbard, "you had forgotten, or perhaps you never knew, that during your followers' scramble for safety my sword remained unheeded in an easily acceptable spot. Also, that it is as much at home in my left hand as in my right." Like a bull goaded to fury, Stoutenburg made a second and more vigorous thrust at his opponent. But Diogenes was already on guard, calm, very quiet in his movements, and in the manner of a perfect swordsman. Stoutenburg, hot with rage, impetuous and clumsy, was at once at a disadvantage, whilst his foreigner adventurer, entirely self-possessed and good-humoured, had the art of the sword at his fingertips, the art of perfect self-control, the art of not rushing to the attack, the supreme art of waiting for an opportunity. No feint or thrust at first, only on guard, quietly on guard, and Bucephalus seemed to be infinitely multiplied at times, so quickly did the bright steel flash out in the grey light and then subside again. Stoutenburg was at once conscious of his own disadvantage. He was no match for this brilliant sword play. His opponent did indeed appear to be only playing with him, but Stoutenburg felt all the time that the abominable knave must disarm him any moment, if he were so minded. Nor could he see very clearly. The passionate blood in him had rushed to his head and was beating furiously in his temples, whilst the other man, with additional advantage of a good position against the wall, kept up a perfect fusillade and good-humoured comments. "Well, attack, my lord," he cried gaily. "Dondersteen, were I as fat as your magnificence supposes, your sword would ere now have made a hole in my side. Pity I am not a broder, is it not? Or more in the way of your sword." There he added, as with a quick and sudden turn of the wrist, he knocked his opponent's weapon out of his hand. "Allow me to return you the most useful sword." He had already stooped and picked up Stoutenburg's sword, and now was holding it with slender fingertips by the point of its blade, and smiling, urbane and mocking. He held it out at his arm's length, bowing the while with courtly, ironical grace. "Shall we call Jan, my lord," he said airily, "or one of your friends to aid you? Some of them, I noticed just now, seemed somewhat in a hurry to quit this hospitable molens. but maybe one or two are still lingering behind." Stoutenburg, blind with rage, had snatched his sword back out of the scoffer's hand. He knew that the man was only playing with him, only keeping him busy here to prevent his going to Gilda. This thought threw him into a frenzy of excitement, and not heeding the other's jeers, he cried out at the top of his voice, "Jan, Jan, Nicholas, what ho!" And the other man, putting his hand up to his mouth, also shouted lustily, "Jan, Nicholas, what ho!" Had Stoutenburg been less blind and deaf to aught save to his own hatred and his own fury, he would have heard not many paces away the sound of horses' hoofs upon the hard ground, the champing of bits, the jangle of harness. But of this he did not think, not just yet. His thoughts were only of Gilda, and that man was holding the door of the hut because he meant to dispute with him the possession of Gilda. He cast aside all sense of pride and shame. He was no match with a foreign mercenary whose profession was that of arms. There was no disgrace in his want of skill, but he would not yield the ground to this adventurer who meant to snatch Gilda away from him. After all, the man had a wounded shoulder and a lacerated hip. With the aid of Jan and Nicholas, he could soon be rendered helpless. New hope rose in the Lord of Stoutenburg's heart, giving vigor to his arm. Now he heard the sound of running footsteps behind him. Jan was coming to his aid, and there were others, Nicholas no doubt, and Heemskerk. My lord," cried Jan, horrified at what he saw. He had heard the clang of steel against steel, and had caught up the first sword that came to his hand. His calls, and those of Stoutenburg as well as the more lusty ones of Diogenes, reached the ears of Beresteyn, who with his friend Heemskerk was making a final survey of the molens, to search for compromising papers that might have been left about. They too heard the cries and the clash of steel. They ran down the steps of the molens, only to meet Jan, who was hurrying toward the hut with all his might. "I think my lord is being attacked," shouted Jan, as he flew past, "and the jongejuffrouw is still in the hut." These last words dissipated Nicholas Beresteyn's sudden thoughts of cowardice. He too snatched up a sword, and followed by Heemskerk, he ran in Jan's wake. The stranger, so lately a prisoner condemned to hang, was in the doorway of the hut, with his back to it, his sword in his left hand, keeping my lord Stoutenburg at arm's length. Jan, Nicholas, and Heemskerk were on him in a trice. 2, 3, how many of you? Queried Diogenes with a laugh, as with smart riposte he met the 3 blades which suddenly flashed out against him. "Ah, Mynheer Beresteyn, my good Jan, I little thought that I would see you again." "Let me pass, man," cried Beresteyn. "I must to my sister." "Not yet, friend," he replied, "till I know what your intentions are." For one instant Beresteyn appeared to hesitate. The kind sentiment which had prompted him a while ago to speak sympathetic words to a condemned man who had taken so much guilt upon his shoulders still fought in his heart against his hatred for the man himself. Since that tragic moment at the foot of the gallows, which had softened his mood, Beresteyn had learnt that it was this man who had betrayed him and his friends to the Stadtholder, and guessed that it was Gilda who had instigated or bribed him into that betrayal. And now the present position seemed to bring vividly before his mind the picture of that afternoon in the Lame Cow at Haarlem, when the knave whom he had paid to keep Gilda safely out of the way was bargaining with his father to bring her back to him. All the hatred of the past few days, momentarily lulled in the face of a tragedy, rose up once more with renewed intensity in his heart. Here was the man who had betrayed him, and who, triumphant, was about to take Gilda back to Haarlem, and receive a fortune for his reward. while Hemskirk, doubtful and hesitating, marvelled if 'twere wise to take up Stoutenburg's private quarrels rather than follow his other friends to Scheveningen, where safety lay. Jan and Beresteyn, vigorously aided by Stoutenburg, made a concerted attack upon the knave, but it seemed as easy for Bucephalus to deal with 3 blades as with one, and now it appeared to have 3 tongues of pale grey flame that flashed hither and thither, backwards, forwards, left, right, above, below, parry, riposte, an occasional thrust, and always quietly on guard. Diogenes was in his greatest humour, laughing and shouting with glee. To anyone less blind with excitement than were these men, it would soon have been clear that he was shouting for the sole purpose of making a noise louder than the hammerings, the jinglings, the knocking that was going on at the back of the hut. To right and left of the front of the small building, a high wooden paling ran for a distance of 100 paces or so, enclosing a rough yard with a shed in the rear. It was impossible to see over the palings what was going on behind them, and so loudly did the philosopher shout and laugh, and so vigorously did steel strike against steel, that it was equally impossible to perceive the sounds that came from there. But suddenly Stoutenburg was on the alert. Something had caught his ear, a sound that rose above the din that was going on in the doorway, a woman's piercing shriek. Even the clanging of steel could not drown it, nor the lusty shouts of the fighting philosopher. For a second he strained his ears to listen. It seemed as if invisible hands were suddenly tearing down the wooden palisade that hid the rear of the small building from his view. Before his mental vision a whole picture rose to sight. A window at the back of the hut broken in, Hilda carried away by the friends of this accursed adventure. Jan had said that 2 came to his aid at the foot of the gallows, Maria screaming, the sled in wait, the horses ready to start. "My God, I had not thought of that," cried Jan Nicholas. "In heaven's name, Gilda, after me, quick!" And then he starts to run, skirting the palisade in the direction whence come now quite distinctly that careless rattle, that jingle and stamping of the ground which proclaims the presence of horses on the point of departure. "Jan, in heaven's name, follow me," cries Stoutenburg, pausing one instant ere he rounds the corner of the palisade. "Nicholas, leave that abominable knave. Gilda, I tell you, Gilda, they are carrying her away." Jan already has obeyed, grasping his sword as he does not pause to think. My lord has called, and 'tis my lord whom he follows. He runs after Stoutenburg as fast as his tired limbs will allow. Hemskirk, forgetting his own fears in the excitement of this hand-to-hand combat, follows in their wake. Nicholas, too, at Stoutenburg's call, is ready to follow him. He turns to run when a grasp of iron falls upon his arm, holding it like a vice. He could have screamed with the pain, and the sword which he held falls out of his nerveless fingers. The next moment he feels himself dragged by that same iron grasp through the open door into the hut, and he hears the door slam to and lock behind him. "Your pardon if I have been rough, mynheer," said Diogenes' pleasant voice, "but there was no time to argue outside that door, and you seemed in such a mighty hurry to run straight into that yawning abyss of disgrace." The grasp upon his arm had not relaxed, but it no longer hurt. Yet it was so firm and so absolute that Nicholas felt powerless to wrench himself away. "Let me go," he cried hoarsely. "Not just yet, mynheer," rejoined Diogenes coolly. "Not while this hot temper is upon you. Let the lords of Stoutenburg and our friend Jan fight to their heart's content with the fat philosopher who is well able to hold his own against them, while the other, who is lean and a moderately good coachman, sees that a pair of horses do not rear and bolt during the fray. "Let me go, man, I tell you," cried Beresteyn, who was making frantic efforts to free himself from that slender white grapnel which held his arm as in a vice. "One moment longer, mynheer, and you shall go. The horses of which I speak are harnessed to a sled, wherein is the jongejuffrouw, your sister." "Yes, verdommte curl, let me get to her, or—" "As soon as that fat philosopher has disposed of the Lord of Stoutenburg and of Jan, he too will jump into the sled, and a minute later will be speeding on its way to Haarlem. And there will be 3 of us left here to hang you to that same gallows on which you should have dangled an hour ago," exclaimed Beresteyn savagely. "Possibly," retorted Diogenes dryly, "but even so your sister will be on the way to Haarlem rather than to exile, whither the Lord of Stoutenburg and you, her brother, would drag her. And what is that to you, you abominable plepshark, whether I go with my sister and my friend? Only this, mynheer, that yesterday in this very room I proclaimed myself a forger, a liar, and a thief before the jongejuffrouw, in order that her love for her only brother should not receive a mortal wound. At that moment I did greatly care for that lie," he added with his wonted flippancy, "but time hath lent it enchantment. It is on the whole one of the finest lies I ever told in my life. Moreover, it carried conviction. The jongejuffrouw was deceived. Now I will not see that pet lie of mine made fruitless by the abominable action which you have in contemplation." Beresteyn made no immediate reply. Easily swayed as he always was by a character stronger than his own, the words spoken by the man whom he had always affected to despise could not fail to move him. He knew that that same abominable action of which he was being accused had indeed been contemplated, not only by Stoutenburg but also by himself. It had only required one word from Stoutenburg, "Gilda, of course, comes with us," one hint that her presence in Holland would be a perpetual menace to his personal safety, and he had been not only willing but fully prepared to put this final outrage upon the woman whom he should have protected with his life. Therefore now he dared not meet this eager questioning glance of this adventurer, in whose merry eyes the look of irrepressible laughter was momentarily veiled by one of anxiety. He looked around him restlessly, shiftily. His wandering glance fell on the narrow inner door, which stood open, and he caught a glimpse of a smaller room beyond, with a window in that further end of it. That window had been broken in from without, the narrow frame torn out of its socket, and the mullion wrenched out of its groove. Through the wide breach thus made in the lath and mud walls of the hut, Beresteyn suddenly saw the horses and the sled out there in the open. The fight of a while ago by the front door had now been transferred to this spot. A short fat man with his back to the rear of the sled was holding the Lord Stoutenburg and Heemskerk in a couple of arms' length with the point of his sword. Jan was apparently not yet on the scene. Another man, lean and tall, was on the box of the sled, trying with all his might to hold a pair of horses in, who, frightened by the clang of steel against steel, by the movement and the shouting, were threatening to plunge and rear at any moment. Diogenes laughed aloud. "My friend Pythagoras seems somewhat hard pressed," he said, "and those horses might complicate the situation at any moment."
I must to them now, mynheer. Tell me then quickly, which you mean to do, behave like an honest man, or like a cur?" "What right have you to dictate to me?" said Beresteyn sullenly. "I have no account to give to you of mine own actions." "None, I admit," rejoined the philosopher placidly. "But let me put the situation a little more clearly before you. On the one hand, you must own that I could at this moment, with very little trouble and hardly any scruples, render you physically helpless first, then lock you up in this room, and go and join my friends outside. On the other hand, you could leave this room sound in body and at heart an honest man, jump into that sled beside your sister and convey her yourself safely back to the home from whence you, her own brother, should never have allowed her to be taken." "I cannot do it," retorted Beresteyn moodily. "I could not meet my father face to face after what has happened." "Think you Gilda would tell him that his only son has played the part of a traitor? She loathes and despises me. She has a horror of that treacherous plot, but the plot has come to naught, and she will consider that you are punished enough for it already, and feel happy that you are free from Stoutenburg's clutches. I cannot leave Stoutenburg now, and she must go with him. She hates me for the outrage which was committed against her. She does not know your share in it," said Diogenes quickly. "Have I not told you that I lied admirably? She believes me to be the only culprit, and to have forged your name to hide my own infamy." A hot flush rose to Beresteyn's pale cheeks. "I cannot bear to profit by your generosity," he said dully. "Posh, man," rejoined the other, not without a tone of bitterness. "What matters what my reputation is in her sight? She despises me so utterly already that a few sins more or less cannot lower me further in her sight." No, I cannot do it," persisted Beresteyn. "Go to your friends, man," he added fiercely. "The fat one is getting sorely pressed. The other cannot cope with the horses much longer. Go to their aid and kill me if you are so minded. Indeed, I no longer care, and in any case I could not survive all this shame." "Die by all means, where and when you list," said Diogenes placidly, "but 'tis your place first of all to take your sister now under your own protection, to keep her in that knowledge that whatever sins you may have committed, you were at least true and loyal to herself. By heaven, man, hath she not suffered enough already in her person, in her pride, above all in her affections? Your loyalty to her at this moment would be an ample compensation for all that she hath suffered. Be an honest man, take her to her home." "How can I? I have no home, and she is a menace to us all." "I am a menace to you, you weak-hearted craven," cried Diogenes, whose moustache bristled with fury now. "For by heaven I swear that you shall not leave this place with a whole skin, save to do an honest man's act of reparation." And as if to give greater emphasis to his words, Diogenes gave the other man's arm a vigorous wrench, which caused Beresteyn to groan and curse with pain. "I may have hurt you worse than this presently," said the philosopher imperturbably, as he dragged Beresteyn, who by now felt dizzy and helpless, to the nearest chair and deposited him there. "Were you not her brother, I believe I should crack your obstinate skull. As it is, I will leave you here to take counsel with reason and honesty until I have finally disposed of my Lord of Stoutenburg." He ran quickly to the outer door, pushed the bolts home, gave the key an extra turn, and then pulled it out of the lock and threw it out the window. Beresteyn, somewhat stunned with emotion, a little faint with that vigorous wrench on his arm, and prostrate with fatigue and excitement of the past 2 days, made no attempt to stop him. No doubt he realized that any such attempt would indeed be useless. There was so much vitality, so much strength in the man, that his tall stature appeared to Nicholas now of a giant-like proportions, and his powers to savor of the supernatural. He watched him with dull, tired eyes as he finally went out of the room through the inner door. No doubt that this too he locked behind him. Beresteyn did not know. He half lay, half sat in the chair like a log. The sound of the fight outside, of the shouts that greeted Diogenes' arrival, and of the latter's merry laughter that went echoing through the mist, only reached his dull perceptions like a far-off dream. But in his mind he saw it all. The walls of the hut were transparent before his mental vision. He saw now the unequal fight, a perfect swordsman against Stoutenburg's unreasoning attacks and Heemskerk's want of skill. Jan too will have joined them by now, but he was loutish and clumsy. The issue would have been a foregone conclusion, even without the aid of the fat knave, who had held his own already for nearly 10 minutes. Yet, though his thoughts were not by any means all clear upon the subject, Beresteyn made no attempt to go to his own friend's assistance. Vaguely some pleasing visions began to float through the space around him. It seemed as if the magic personality of a nameless adventure still filled his narrow room with its vitality, with its joy, and with its laughter. The optimistic breeziness which emanated from the man himself had lingered here after he was gone. His cheerful words still hung and reverberated upon the cold, wintry air. After all, why not, mused Beresteyn. Gilda knew of his share in the conspiracy against the Stadtholder, of course, but that conspiracy had now aborted. Gilda would never betray her brother's share in it, either to the Stadtholder's vengeance or to her father's wrath, and she had been made to believe that he was not the mover of the outrage against her person. Then why not? She had been forcibly dragged out of this hut. She knew that Stoutenburg meant to take her away with him into exile. Even if she had been only partially conscious, since she was taken to the sled, she would know that a desperate fight had been going on around her. Then if he, Nicholas, now appeared upon the scene, if he took charge of her and of the sled, and with the help of one or other of those knaves outside sped away with her north to Haarlem, would she not be confirmed in her belief of his loyalty? Would he not play a heroic role, make her happy and himself free? Then why not? All the papers relating to the aborted conspiracy, which might have compromised him, he had upon his person even now. He and Heemskerk had themselves collected them in the weighing room of the molens after Lucas of Sparendam had brought his terrible news. Then why not? He rose briskly from his chair. The outer door of the hut was locked. He crossed to the inner door. That was just on the latch, and he threw it open. Before him now was the broken window frame, through which peeped the dull grey light of this misty winter's morning. Out in the open, through the filmy veil of the fog, he could see the final phases of an unequal fight. Stoutenburg and Heemskerk were both disarmed, and Jan had just appeared upon the scene. More far-seeing than were the Lord of Stoutenburg and Mynheer Heemskerk, he had very quickly realized that, sword in hand, No one was a match for this foreigner and his invincible blade. When the fighting was transferred from the doorway of the hut to the open roadway in the rear, he had first followed in the wake of his chief, then had doubled back, swiftly running to the molens, and in the basement from out of the scattered litter of arms, hastily thrown down, he had quickly picked up a couple of pistols, found some ammunition, quietly loaded the weapons, and with them in his hand started to run back to the hut. All this had taken some few moments, while Pythagoras had borne the brunt of a vigorous attack from the Lord of Stoutenburg and Mynheer Heemskerk, whilst Diogenes parleyed with Beresteyn inside the hut. Beresteyn saw the whole picture before him. He had thrown open the door and looked through the broken window at the precise moment when the Lord of Stoutenburg's sword flew out of his hand. Then it was that Jan came running along, shouting to my lord. Stoutenburg turned quickly, saw his faithful lieutenant, and caught sight of the pistols which he held. The next second he had snatched one out of Jan's hand, and the pale ray of a wintry sun penetrating through the mist found its reflection in a couple of steel barrels pointed straight at the laughing philosopher. Beresteyn, from within, felt indeed as if his heart stood still. For that one brief palpitating second was fate after all, taking the decision for the future, Gilda and his, out of his hands into her own. Would a bullet end that vigorous life, and still that merry laugh, and that biting tongue forever, and leave Nicholas to be swayed once more by the dark schemes and arbitrary will of his friend Stoutenburg? Fate was ready, calmly spinning the threads of human destinies. But there are some men in the world who have the power and the skill to take their destinies in their own hands. The philosopher and weaver of dreams, the merry, laughing cavalier, was one of these. What the Lord of Stoutenburg had seen that he perceived equally quickly, he too had caught sight of Jan and of the two steel barrels simultaneously levelled at him. He too realized that the most skilled swordsman is but a sorry match against a pair of bullets. But while Beresteyn held his breath, and Stoutenburg tried to steady the trembling of his hand, he raised Bucephalus above his head, and with a wild shout pointed toward the southern horizon far away. "The Stadtholder's guard!" he cried lustily. "They are on us! Sauve Qui Peut!" Three cries of mad terror rent the air. There was a double detonation, a great deal of smoke. The horses in the sled reared and plunged wildly, forcing those who were nearest to the vehicle to beat a precipitate retreat. "At the horses' heads, you wooden-headed bladder!" shouted Diogenes lustily. Pythagoras did his best to obey, while Socrates was nearly dragged off the box by the frightened horses. Heemskerk had already incontinently taken to his heels. Jan had dropped his weapons, which Diogenes at once picked up. The Lord of Stoutenburg was preparing to fire again. "Sauve Qui Peut, my lords!" cried Diogenes. "Before I change my mind and put a hole through your heel, which will prevent your running away fast enough to escape the Stadtholder's wrath." There was another detonation. The horses reared and plunged again. When Beresteyn once more obtained a clear view of the picture, he saw the Lord of Stoutenburg stretched out on his back upon the ground, in a position that was anything but dignified, and certainly very perilous, for Diogenes, towering above him, was holding him by both feet. The tall, soldierly figure of the foreigner stood out clearly silhouetted against the grey misty light. His head, with its wreath of unruly brown curls, was thrown back with a gesture of almost suggested boyishness. delight in some impish mischief, while his infectious laugh echoed and re-echoed against the walls of the molens and of the hut. Jan was on his hands and knees crawling toward those two men, the conqueror and the conquered, with no doubt a vague idea that he might even now render assistance to my lord. "Here, Pythagoras, old fathead," cried Diogenes gaily, "see that our friend here does not interfere with me, and that he hath not a concealed poniard somewhere about his person. Then collect all pistols and swords that are lying about, well out of harm's way. In the meanwhile, what am I to do with his magnificence? He is kicking like a vicious colt, and that shoulder of mine is beginning to sting like fury." "Kill me, man, kill me," cried Stoutenburg savagely. "Curse you, why don't you end this farce?" "Because, my lord," said Diogenes more seriously than his wont, "the purest and most exquisite woman on God's earth did not once deign to bestow the priceless jewel of her love upon you. Did she know of your present plight, she would even now be pleading for you. Therefore," he added more flippantly, "I am going to give myself the satisfaction of making you a present of the last miserable shred of existence which you will drag on from this hour forth in wretchedness and exile to the end of your days. Take your life and your freedom, my lord," he continued in response to the invectives which Stoutenburg muttered savagely under his breath. "Take it at the hands of the miserable plepshurk whom you so despise. It is better, methinks, to do this rather than fall into the hands of the stadtholder, whose mercy for a fallen enemy would be equal to your own." Then he shouted to Pythagoras, "Here, old compere, search his magnificence for concealed weapons, and then make ready to go. We have wasted too much time already." Despite Stoutenburg's struggles and curses, Pythagoras obeyed his brother philosopher to the letter. His lordship and Jan were both effectually disarmed now. Then only did Diogenes allow Stoutenburg to struggle to his feet. He had his sword in his left hand, and Pythagoras stood beside him. Jan found his master's hat and cloak and helped him on with them, and then said quietly, "The minutes are precious, my lord. 'Tis a brief run to Ryswyk. My lord of Heemskerk is gone, and Mynheer Beresteyn has disappeared. Here we can do nothing more." "Nothing, my good Jan," said Diogenes more seriously. "You are a brave soldier and a faithful servant. Take his magnificence away to safety. You have well deserved your own." Stoutenburg gave a last cry of rage and of despair. For a moment it seemed as if his blind fury would still conquer reason and prudence, and that he meant once more to make an attack upon his victorious enemy. But something in the latter's look of almost insolent triumph recalled him to the peril of his own situation. He passed his hand once or twice over his brow, like a man who is dazed and only just returning to consciousness. Then he called loudly to Jan to follow him, and walked rapidly away northwards through the fog. Beresteyn went up to the broken window and watched him till he was out of sight. Then he looked on Diogenes. That philosopher also watched the retreating figure of the Lord of Stoutenburg until the fog swallowed it up, and then he turned to his friend. "Pythagoras, old compeer," he said with a shrug of his broad shoulders, "what would you take to be walking at this moment in that man's shoes?" "I wouldn't do it, friend," rejoined Pythagoras placidly, "for the possession of a running river of home-brewed ale, and I am mighty dry at the present moment." "Jump up then on the box beside Socrates, you old wine-tub, and get to Layden as quickly as those horses will take you. A halt at Voorburg will refresh you all." "But you queried Socrates from his post of vantage. "I shall make my way to Roswick first, and get a horse there. I shall follow you at a distance, and probably overtake you before you get to Layden. But you will not see me after this, unless there is trouble, which is not likely." "But the jongejuffrouw," persisted Socrates. "Hush! I shall never really lose sight of you in the sled, but you must serve her as best you can. Someone will be with her who will know how to take care of her." "Who?" "Her own brother, of course, Mynheer Beresteyn." "Over the sill, Mynheer!" he shouted, calling to Nicholas, who still stood undecided, shamed, hesitating in the broken framework of the window. "Over the sill! 'Tis only 3 feet from the ground, and horses or men are quite ready for you." He gave a lusty cheer of satisfaction as Beresteyn, throwing all final cowardly hesitations to the wind, suddenly made up his mind to take the one wise and prudent course. He swung himself through the window, and a few moments was standing by Diogenes' side. "Let me at least tell you, sir," he began earnestly. "Hush! Tell me nothing now," broke in the other man quickly. "The jongejuffrouw might hear you." "But I must thank you." "If you say another word," said Diogenes, sinking his voice to a whisper, "I'll order Socrates to drive on and leave you standing here." "But—" "Into the sled, man, in heaven's name. The jongejuffrouw is unconscious, her woman daft with fear. When the lady regains consciousness, let her brother's face be the first sight to comfort her. Into the sled, man," he added impatiently, "or by heaven, I'll give the order to start." And without more ado, he hustled Nicholas into the sled. The latter, bewildered, really not clear with himself as to what he ought to do, peeped tentatively beneath the cover of the vehicle. He saw his sister lying there prone upon the wooden floor of the sled. Her head rested against a bundle of rags, hastily put together for her comfort. Maria was squatting beside her, her head and ears muffled in a cloak, her hands up to her eyes. She was moaning incoherently to herself. Gilda's eyes were closed, and her face looked very pale. Beresteyn's heart ached at the pitiful sight. She looked so wan and so forlorn that a sharp pang of remorse for all his cruelty to her shot right through his dormant sensibilities. There was just room for him under the low cover of the sled. He hesitated no longer now. He felt indeed as if nothing would tear him away from Gilda's side until she was safely home again in her father's arms. A peremptory order, "Avaunt!" struck upon his ear, a shout from the driver to his horses, and the harness rattled and the sled creaked upon its framework, and then slowly began to move. Beresteyn lifted the flap of the hood at the rear of the vehicle and looked out for the last time upon the molens and the hut where such a tragic act in his life's drama had just been enacted. He saw Diogenes still standing there, waving his hat in a farewell. For a few moments longer his splendid figure stood out clearly against the flat grey landscape. Beyond, then slowly the veil of the mist began to envelop him, at first only blurring the outline of his mantle or his sash. Then it grew more dense, and the sled moved away more rapidly. The next moment the Laughing Cavalier had disappeared from view.
Chapter 43 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Burleson. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor to the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 43. Layden once more. After that, Gilda had lived as in a dream, only vaguely conscious that good horses and a smoothly gliding vehicle were conveying her back to her home. Of this fact she was sure. Nicholas was sitting quite close under the hood of the sledge, and when first she became fully aware of the reality of his presence, he had raised her hand to his lips and had said in response to a mute appeal from her eyes, "We are going home." After that a quiet sense of utter weariness pervaded her being, and she fell into a troubled sleep. She did not heed what went on around her. She only knew that once or twice during the day there was a halt for food and drink. The nearness of her brother, his gentleness toward her, gave her a sense of well-being, even though her heart felt heavy with a great sorrow, which made the whole future appear before her like an interminable vista of blank and grey dullness. It was at her suggestion that arrangements were made for an all-night halt at Layden, which city they reached in the early part of the afternoon. She begged Nicholas that they might put up at the hostelry of the White Goat on the farther side of the town, and that from thence a messenger might be sent to her father, asking him to come and meet her there on the morrow. Though Nicholas was not a little astonished at this suggestion of Gilda's, seeing that surely she must be longing to be home again, and that Haarlem could easily have been reached before night, he did not wish to run counter to her will. True enough, he dreaded the meeting with his father, but he knew that it had to come, and felt that whatever might be the future consequences of it all, he could not possibly bear alone the burden of remorse and of shame which assailed him every time he encountered Gilda's tear-stained eyes and saw how wearied and listless she looked. So he called a halt at the White Goat, and as soon as he saw his sister safely installed, with everything ordered for her comfort, and a tasteful supper prepared, he sent a messenger on horseback at once to Haarlem to his father. Gilda had deliberately chosen to spend the night at the hostelry of the White Goat, because she felt that in that quaint old building with its wide oak staircase, over which she had been carried 5 days ago, dizzy and half fainting, the blackened rafters would mayhap still echo with the sound of a merry laughter which she would never hear again. But when the sledge finally turned in under the low gateway and drew up in the small courtyard of the inn, when with wearied feet and shaking knees she walked up those oaken stairs, it seemed to her that the vivid memories which the whole place recalled were far harder to bear than those more intangible ones which, waking and sleeping, had tortured her up to now. The bedroom, too, with the smaller one leading out of it, was the same in which she had slept. As the obsequious waiting wench threw open the door for the noble Jungfrau to pass through, she saw before her the wide open hearth with its crackling fire, the high-backed chair wherein she had sat, the very footstool which he had put to her feet. It seemed to her at first as if she could not enter, as if his splendid figure would suddenly emerge out of the semi-darkness to confront her with his mocking eyes and his smiling face. She seemed to see him everywhere, and she had to close her eyes to chase away that all too insistent vision. The waiting wench did not help matters either, for she asked persistently and shyly about the handsome Mynheer, who had such an irresistible fund of laughter in him. Maria, too, in her mutterings and grumblings, contrived, most unwittingly, since she adored Gilda, to inflict a series of tiny pin-pricks on an already suffering heart. Tired in body and in mind, Gilda could not sleep that night. She was living over again every second of the past 5 days. The interview with that strangely winning person, a stranger still to her then, here in this room. How she had hated him at first, how she had tried to shame and wound him with her words, trying all the while to steel her heart against that irresistible gaiety and good humour which shone from him like a radiance. Then that second interview in Rotterdam. Did she still hate him then? And if not, when was hatred first changed into the love which now so completely filled her soul? Looking back on those days, she could not tell. All that she knew was that when he was brought before her helpless and pinioned, she already loved him, and that since that moment love had grown and strengthened until her whole heart was given to that same nameless soldier of fortune whom she had at first despised. To live over again those few brief days, which seemed now like an eternity, was a sweet, sad pleasure which Gilda could endure. But what became intolerable in the darkness and in the silence of the night was the remembrance of the immediate past. Clearly cut out before her mental vision were the pictures of her life this morning in the hut beside the molens, and indeed it was a lifetime that had gone by in those few hours. Firstly, Stoutenburg's visit in the early morning, his smooth words and careless chatter. She, poor fool, under the belief all the time that the treacherous plot had been abandoned, and that she would forthwith be conveyed back to her father. Her thoughts of pleading for the condemned man's life, then the tramping of feet, the cries of terror, her brother's appearance bringing the awful news of betrayal. She lived over again those moments of supreme horror when she realized how Stoutenburg had deceived her, and that Nicholas himself was but a traitor and a miserable liar. She knew then that it was the adventurer, the penniless soldier of fortune, whom she had tried to hate and to despise, who had quietly gone to warn the stadtholder, and that his action had been the direct working of God's will in a brave and loyal soul. She knew also by a mysterious intuition which no good woman has ever been able to resist, that the man who had stood before her, self-convicted and self-confessed, had accepted that humiliation to save her the pain of fearing and despising her own brother. The visions now became more dim and blurred. She remembered Stoutenburg's fury, his hideous threats of vengeance on the man who had thrown himself across his treacherous path. She remembered pleading to that monster, weeping, clinging to his arm in a passionate appeal. She remembered the soul agony which she felt when she realized that that appeal had been in vain. Then she had stood for a moment silent and alone in the hut. Stoutenburg had left her in order to accomplish that hideous act of revenge. After that she remembered nothing clearly. She could only have been half conscious, and all around her there was a confusion of sounds, of shouts, and clash of arms. She thought that she was being lifted out of the chair onto which she had fallen in a partial swoon, that she heard Maria's cries of terror, and that she felt the cold, damp morning air striking upon her face. Presently she knew that Nicholas was beside her, and that she was being taken home. All else was a blank or a dream. Now she was tossing restlessly upon the lavender-scented bed in this hostelry so full of memories. Her temples were throbbing. Her eyes felt like pieces of glowing charcoal in her head. The blackness around her weighed upon her soul until she felt that she could not breathe. Outside, the silence of the night was being gravely disturbed. There was the sound of horses' hoofs upon the cobblestones of the yard, the creaking of a vehicle brought to a standstill, the usual shout for grooms and ostlers. A late arrival had filled the tranquil inn with its bustle and its noise. Then once again all was still, and Gilda turned her aching head upon the pillow. Though the room was not hot and the atmosphere outside heavy with frost, she felt positively stifled. After a while this feeling of oppression became intolerable. She rose, and in the darkness she groped for her fur-lined cloak, which she wrapped closely around her. Then she found her way across to the window and drew aside the curtain. No light penetrated through the latticed panes. The waning moon, which 4 nights ago had been at times so marvellously brilliant, had not yet risen above the horizon line. As Gilda's fingers fumbled for the window latch, she heard a distant church clock strike the midnight hour. She threw open the casement. The sill was low, and she leaned out, peering up and down the narrow street. It was entirely deserted and pitch dark, save where on the wall opposite the light from a window immediately below her threw its feeble reflection. Vaguely she wondered who was astir in the small hostelry. No doubt it was the tap-room, which was there below her, still lighted up, and apparently with its small casement also thrown open, like the one out of which she was leaning. For now, when the reverberating echo of the chiming clock had entirely died away, she was conscious of a vague murmur of voices coming up from below, confused at first and indistinguishable. But presently she heard a click, as if the casement had been pushed further open, or mayhap a curtain pulled aside, for after that the sound of the voices became more distinct and clear. With beating heart and straining ears, Gilda leaned as far out of the window as she could, listening intently. She had recognized her father's voice, and he was speaking so strangely that even as she listened she felt all the blood tingling in her veins. "My son, sir," he was saying, "had, I am glad to say, sufficient pride and manhood in him not to bear the full weight of your generosity any longer. He sent a special messenger on horseback out to me this afternoon. As soon as I knew that my daughter was here, I came as fast as a sleigh and the 3 best horses in my stables could bring me. I had no thought, of course, of seeing you here." "I had no thought that you should see me, sir," said a voice which by its vibrating tones had the power of sending the hot blood rushing to the listener's neck and cheeks. "Had I not entered the yard just as your sledge turned in under the gateway, you had not been offended by mine unworthy presence." "I would in that case have searched the length and breadth of this land to find you, sir," rejoined Cornelius Beresteyn earnestly. "For half an hour later my son had told me of the whole circumstances of his association with you. An association of which Mynheer Nicholas will never be over proud, I'll warrant," came in slightly less flippant accents than usual from the foreigner. "Do I not stand self-confessed as a liar, a forger, and an abductor of helpless women? A fine record, forsooth! And ere he ordered me to be hanged, my Lord of Stoutenburg did loudly proclaim me as such before his friends and before his followers." "His friends, sir, are the sons of my friends. I will loudly proclaim you what you truly are, a brave man, a loyal soldier, a noble gentleman. Nicholas has told me every phase of his association with you, from his shameful proposal to you in regard to his own sister, down to this moment when you still desired that Gilda and I should remain in ignorance of his guilt." "What is the good, Mynheer, of raking up all this past?" said the philosopher lightly. "I would that Mynheer Nicholas had known how to hold his tongue." "Thank God that he did not," retorted Cornelius Beresteyn hotly. "Had he done so, I stood in peril of failing, for the first time in my life, in an important business obligation." "Not towards me, Mynheer, at any rate." "Yes, sir, towards you," affirmed Beresteyn decisively. "I promised you 500,000 guilders if you brought my daughter safely back to me. I know from mine own son, sir, that I owe her safety to no one but to you." "Ours was an ignoble bargain, Mynheer," said Diogenes with his wonted gaiety, and though she could not see him, Gilda could picture his face now alive with merriment and suppressed laughter. "The humour of the situation appealed to me. It proved irresistible, but the bargain in no way binds you, seeing that it was I who had been impious enough to lay hands upon your daughter." "At my son's suggestion, I know," rejoined Beresteyn quietly, "and from your subsequent acts, sir, I must infer that you only did it because you felt that she was safer under your charge than at the mercy of her own brother and his friends. Nay, do not protest," he added earnestly. "Nicholas, as you see, is of the same opinion." "May heaven reward you, sir, for that kindly thought of me," said Diogenes more seriously. "It will cheer me in the future, when I and all my doings will have faded from your ken." "You are not leaving Holland, sir?" "Not just now, Mynheer, while there is still so much fighting to be done. The Stadtholder hath need of soldiers." and he will, sir, find none better than you throughout the world, and with a goodly fortune to help you." "Speak not of that, mynheer," he said firmly. "I could not take your money. If I did, I should never know a happy hour again." "Oh!" "I am quite serious, sir, though indeed you might not think that I can ever be serious. For 6 days now I have had a paymaster. Mynheer Nicholas's money has burned a hole in my good humour. It has scorched my hands, wounded my shoulder, and lacerated my hip. It has brought on me all the unpleasant sensations which I have so carefully avoided hitherto, remorse, humiliation, and 1 or 2 other sensations which will never leave me until my death. It changed temporarily the shiftless, penniless soldier of fortune into a responsible human being, with obligations and duties. I had to order horses, bespeak lodgings, keep accounts. Ye gods, it made a slave of me. Keep your money, sir. It is more fit for you to handle than for me. Let me go back to my shiftlessness, my penury, my freedom, eat my fill today, starve tomorrow, and one day look up at the stars from the lowly earth with a kindly bullet in my chest that does not mean to blunder. And if in the days to come your thoughts ever do revert to me, I pray you think of me as happy, or nearly so, owning no master save my whim, bending my back to none, keeping my hat on my head when I choose, and ending my days in a ditch or in a palace, the carver of mine own destiny, the sole arbiter of my will. And now I pray you seek that rest of which you must be sorely in need. I start at daybreak tomorrow. Mayhap we shall never meet again, save in heaven, if indeed there be room there for such a thriftless adventurer as I." "But whither do you mean to go, sir?" "To the mountains of the moon, sir," rejoined the philosopher lightly, "or along the Milky Way to the land of the might have been." "Before we part, sir, may I shake you by the hand?" There was silence down below after that. Gilda listened in vain. No further words reached her ears just then. She tiptoed as quietly as she could across the room, finding her way with difficulty in the dark. At last her fumbling fingers encountered the latch of the door of the inner room, where Maria lay snoring lustily. It took Gilda some little time to wake the old woman, but at last she succeeded, and then ordered her, very peremptorily, to strike a light. "Are you ill, my Frau?" queried Maria anxiously, even though she was but half awake. "No," replied Gilda curtly, "but I want my dress. Quick now," she added, for Maria showed signs of desiring to protest. The young Frau was in one of those former imperious moods of hers when she exacted implicit obedience from her servants. Alas, the last few days had seen that mood submerged into an ocean of sorrow and humiliation, and Maria, though angered at having been wakened out of a first sleep, was very glad to see her darling looking so alert and so brisk. Indeed, the light being very dim, Maria could not see the brilliant glow that lit up the Jungfrau's cheeks, as with somewhat febrile gestures she put on her dress and smoothed her hair. "Now you put on your dress too, Maria," she said when she was ready, "and tell my father, who is either in the tap room down below or hath already retired to his room, that I desire to speak with him. And Maria
Chapter 44 of The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 44, Blake of Blakeney. While Maria completed a hasty toilet, Gilda's instinct had drawn her back once more to the open window. The light from the room below was still reflected on the opposite wall, and from the tap room the buzz of voices had not altogether ceased. Cornelius Beresteyn was speaking now. "Indeed," he said, "it will be the one consolation left to me, since you do reject my friendship, sir." "Not your friendship, sir, only your money," interposed Diogenes. "Well, you do speak of lifelong parting. But your two friends have indeed deserved well of me. Without their help, no doubt you, sir, first, and then my dearly loved daughter, would have fallen victims to that infamous Stoutenburg. Will a present of 20,000 guilders each gratify them, do you think?" A ringing laugh roused the echoes of the sleeping hostelry. 20,000 guilders, ye gods!" exclaimed Diogenes merrily. "Pythagoras, dost hear, old bladder-face? Socrates, my Robin, dost realize it? 20,000 guilders each in your pockets, old compeers. Lord, how drunk you will both be to-morrow." Out of the confused hubbub that ensued, Gilda could disentangle nothing definite. There was a good deal of shouting and clapping of pewter mugs against a table, and through it all that irresponsible, infectious laughter which, strangely enough, had to Gilda's ears at this moment a curious tone, almost of bitterness, as if its merriment was only forced. Then, when the outburst of gaiety had somewhat subsided, she once more heard her father's voice. Maria was dressed by this time, and now at a word from Gilda was ready to go downstairs and to deliver the jongejuffrouw's message to her father. "You spoke so lightly just now, sir, of dying in a ditch or palace," Cornelius Beresteyn was saying. "But you did tell me that day in Haarlem that you had kith and kindred in England. Where is that father of whom you spoke, and your mother who is a saint? Your irresponsible vagabondage will leave her in perpetual loneliness." "My mother is dead, sir," said Diogenes quietly. "My father broke her heart." "Even then he hath a right to know that his son is a brave and loyal gentleman." "He will only know that when his son is dead." "That was a cruel dictum, sir." "Not so cruel as that which left my mother to starve in the streets of Haarlem." "Ay, 10,000 times more cruel, since your dear mother, sir, had not to bear the awful burden of lifelong remorse." "Bah!" rejoined the philosopher with a careless shrug of the shoulders. "A man seldom feels remorse for wrongs committed against a woman." "But he doth for those committed against his flesh and blood, his son." "I have no means of finding out, sir, if my father hath or hath not remorse for his wilful desertion of wife and child. England is a far-off country. I would not care to undertake so unprofitable a pilgrimage." "Then why not let me do so, sir?" queried Cornelius Beresteyn calmly. "You?" "Yes, why not? Why should you trouble, mynheer, to seek out the father of such a vagabond as I?" "Because I would like to give a man, an old man your father must be now, the happiness of calling you his son. You say he lives in England. I often go to England on business. Will you not at least tell me your father's name?" "I have no cause to conceal it, mynheer," rejoined Diogenes carelessly. "In England they call him Blake of Blakeney. His home is in Sussex, and I believe that it is a stately home." "But I know the Squire of Blakeney well," said Cornelius Beresteyn eagerly. "My bankers at Amsterdam also do business for him. I know that just now he is in Antwerp on a mission from King James of England to the Archduchess. He hath oft told Mynheer Beuselaar, our mutual banker, that he was moving heaven and earth to find the son whom he had lost." Heaven and earth take a good deal of moving, quoth Diogenes lightly. Once a wife and son have been forsaken, and left to starve in a foreign land. Mine English father wedded my mother in the church of St. Peter at Haarlem. My friend Frans Hals, God bless him, knew my mother, and cared for me after she died. He has all the papers in his charge relating to the marriage. It has long ago been arranged between us that if I die, with ordinary worthiness, he will seek out my father in England, and tell him that mayhap, after all, even though I have been a vagabond all my life, I have never done anything that should cause him to blush for his son. Apparently, at this juncture, Maria must have knocked at the door of the tapperage, for Gilda, whose heart was beating more furiously than ever, heard presently the well-known firm footsteps of her father as he rapidly ascended the stairs. 2 minutes later, Gilda lay against her father's heart, and her hand resting in his, she told him from the beginning to end everything that she had suffered from the moment when, after watch-night service in the Grootkirk, she first became aware of the murmur of voices, to that when she first realized that the man whom she should have hated, the knave whom she should have despised, filled her heart and soul to the exclusion of all other happiness in the world, and that he was about to pass out of her life forever. It took a long time to tell, for she had suffered more, felt more, lived more in the past 5 days than would fill an ordinary life, nor did she disguise anything from her father, not even the conversation which she had had at Rotterdam in the dead of night with the man who had remained nameless until now, and in consequence of which he had gone at once to warn the Stadtholder, and had thus averted the hideous conspiracy which would have darkened for ever the destinies of many Dutch homes. Of Nicholas she did not speak. She knew that he had confessed his guilt to his father, who would know how to forgive in the fullness of time. When she had finished speaking, her father said somewhat roughly, "But for that vervloekte adventurer down there, you would never have suffered, Gilda, as you did." "Nicholas, father dear," she broke in quietly, "is very dear to us both. I think that his momentary weakness will endear him to us even more. But he was a tool in the hands of that unscrupulous Stoutenburg, and but for that nameless and penniless soldier, whose hand you were proud to grasp just now, I would not be here in your arms at this moment." "Ah," said Cornelius Beresteyn dryly, "is this the way that the wind blows, my girl? Did you not know then that the rascal, the day after he dared to lay hands upon you, was back again in Haarlem bargaining with me to restore you to my arms in exchange for a fortune?" "And 2 days later, father dear," she retorted, "he endured insults, injuries, cruelties from Stoutenburg, rather than betray Nicholas's guilt before me." Murmured Cornelius, and there was a humorous twinkle in his eyes as he looked down upon his daughter's bowed head. "And but for that same rascal, father," she continued softly, "you would at this moment be mourning a dead daughter, and Holland a hideous act of treachery." "Hush, my dear," cried the old man impulsively, as he put his kind protecting arms round the child whom he loved so dearly. "I would never have followed the Lord of Stoutenburg while I lived," she said simply. "Please God," he said earnestly, "I would sooner have seen you in the crypt beside your mother." "Then, father, hath not the rascal you speak of deserved well of us? Can we not guess that even originally he took me away from Haarlem only because he knew that if he refused the bargain proposed to him by mine own brother, Stoutenburg would have found some other means of ensuring my silence?" "You are a good advocate, my girl," rejoined Cornelius with a sly wink, which brought the colour rising up to Gilda's cheeks. "I think, by your leave, I'll go and shake that vervloekte Keurl once more by the hand." "And shall I tell him that you bear him no ill will?" he added roguishly. "Yes, father dear, tell him that," she said gently. "Then will you go to bed, dear?" he asked. "You are overwrought and tired." "I will sit by the window quietly for a quarter of an hour," she said. "After that I promise you that I will go peaceably to bed." He kissed her tenderly, for she was very dear to him, but being a man of vast understanding and profound knowledge of men and things, the humorous twinkle did Chapter 45 of the Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Laughing Cavalier, Ancestor of the Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 45. The End. Diogenes sat beside the window in the tapperage, listening with half an ear to the sounds in and about the hostelry, which were dying out one by one. At first there had been a footfall in the room overhead, which had seemed to him the sweetest music that man could hear. It had paced somewhat restlessly up and down, and to the Laughing Cavalier, the gay and irresponsible soldier of fortune, it had seemed as if every creaking of a loose board beneath the feather-weight of that footfall found its echo in his heart. But anon Mynheer Cornelius Beresteyn was called away, and then all was still in the room upstairs, and Diogenes, burying his head in his hands, evoked the picture of that room as he had seen it 5 days ago. The proud jongejuffrouw in her high-backed chair, looking on him with blue eyes, which she vainly tried to render hard through their exquisite expression of appealing, childlike gentleness, and he groaned aloud with the misery of the inevitable, which with stern finger bade him go, and leave behind him all the illusions, all the dreams which he had dared to weave. Had she not told him that she despised him, that his existence was as naught to her, that she looked on him as a menial and a knave, somewhat below the faithful henchmen who were in her father's service? Ye gods! He had endured much in his life of privations, of physical and mental pain, but was there aught on earth or in the outermost pits of hell to be compared with the agony of this ending to a dream? The serving wench came in just then. She scarcely dared approach the Mynheer with the merry voice and the laughter-filled eyes, who now looked so inexpressibly sad. Yet she had a message for him. Mynheer Cornelius Beresteyn, she said, desired to speak with him once more. The wench had murmured the words shyly, for her heart was aching for the handsome soldier, and the tears were very near her eyes. But hearing the message he had jumped up with alacrity, and was immediately ready to follow her. Mynheer Beresteyn had a room on the upper floor, she explained, as she led the way upstairs. The old man was standing on the narrow landing, and as soon as Diogenes appeared upon the stairs, he said simply, "There was something I did forget to say to you downstairs. May I trouble you, sir, to come into my room for a moment?" He threw open one of the doors that gave on the landing, and politely stood aside that his visitor might pass through. Diogenes entered the room. He heard the door being closed behind him, and thought that Mynheer Beresteyn had followed him in. The room was very dimly lighted by a couple of tallow candles that flickered in their sconces, and at first he could not see into the dark recesses of the room. But presently something moved, something ethereal and intangible, white and exquisite. It stirred from out the depths of the huge high-backed chair, and from out the gloom there came a little cry of surprise and of joy, which was as the call of bird or angel. He did not dare to move. He scarcely dared to breathe. He looked round for Mynheer Beresteyn, who had disappeared. Surely this could be only a dream. Nothing real on earth could be so exquisite as that subtle vision which he had of her now, sitting in the high-backed chair, leaning slightly forward toward him. Gradually his eyes became accustomed to the gloom. He could see her quite distinctly now, her fair curls round her perfect head, her red lips parted, her eyes fixed upon him with a look which he dared not interpret. All around him was the silence and the darkness of the night, and he was alone with her just as he had been in this very room 5 days ago, and then again at Rotterdam. "St. Bavon, you rogue!" he murmured. "Where are you? How dare you leave me in the lurch like this?" Then, how it all happened he could not himself have told you. He suddenly found himself at her feet, kneeling beside the high-backed chair. His arms were round her shoulders, and he could feel the exquisite perfume of her breath upon his cheek. "St. Bavon!" he cried exultingly to himself. "Go away, you rogue! There's no need for your admonitions now." Mynheer Beresteyn tiptoed quietly into the room. The roguish smile still played round his lips. He came up close to the high-backed chair, and placed his hand upon his daughter's head. Diogenes looked up and met the kindly eyes of the old man, fixed with calm earnestness upon him. "Mynheer," he said, and laughter which contained a world of happiness as well as of joy danced and sparkled in every line of his face. "Just now I refused one half of your fortune, but 'tis your greatest treasure I claim from you now." "Nay, you rascal," rejoined Beresteyn, as he lifted his daughter's chin gently with one finger and looked into her deep blue eyes, which were brimful of happiness. "Methinks that treasure is yours already." "Go back, good St. Bavon," cried the Laughing Cavalier, in an ecstasy of joy. "Your heaven, you rogue, is not more perfect than this." Chapter 45.